Hey there, and welcome back. Whatever this day has asked of you, whatever you have carried through its hours, you can lay all of it down now and let the room soften and darken around you and let your breath come slower and deeper. There is nothing more for you to do tonight. Tonight, we are going to travel a very long way, back more than 600 years, into an age of stone castles and candlelit chapels and the slow white sails of ships. To follow the whole life of a woman most of us have never heard of, and yet whose children would help to remake the map of the earth itself. She was an English princess, born into the proudest house in the land, and she sailed away as a grown woman to become the queen of a far kingdom at the western edge of Europe, where she raised a family of sons so remarkable that their own people remembered them ever after as something close to golden. We are going to live her whole life tonight, gently and unhurried, from a child's grief in a cold English winter to a queen's passing in a plague-struck summer, and see what it truly was to be her, what she loved and what she feared and what she quietly built that would outlast her by centuries. And before the night is over, we will come to a darkened bedchamber near the sea, where a dying queen gathered her sons about her and pressed into their hands the swords she had kept for them, and blessed the bold venture that was even then waiting upon the tide, a venture that would carry her sons' ships out beyond the edges of the mapped seas. But that is the far end of the story, and we are going to begin at its beginning. So settle yourself and let the years fall away. Before we cross over fully into her world, there is one small thing I would ask of you, and then I will leave you in peace with the story. It is a quiet companionship to me, in the stillness of these late hours, to know a little of who is out there listening while the tale unwinds. So if you feel inclined, you might leave a word below to say from what corner of the world you are listening tonight, and how late it has grown where you are lying. I look through the notes that come in, every one of them, and there is a soft pleasure in imagining all those darkened and scattered rooms, each of them hushed, each given over for a while to the same long-ago life as sleep draws near. And if these slow journeys into far-off centuries are something you would like to find your way back to, the simplest way is to subscribe whenever the wish should happen to come to you, offered gently and never pressed. And another of these quiet evenings will make its way to you in time. That is the whole of it. From here on, the night belongs to her, to Philippa, the English girl who would become a queen, and to the remarkable life we are about to enter. Picture this: a great English castle in the depth of winter, more than 600 years ago, its grey walls rising over frozen water meadows, its narrow windows glowing faint and gold against a sky, the colour of iron. Snow lies along the battlements and in the frozen ruts of the road below, and within the thick walls the household moves through the short, dark days by firelight and by candle, wrapped against a cold that never quite lifts from the stone. Somewhere in the warm heart of that castle, in a nursery set high above the great hall, a small girl sits close to the fire, a child of one of the mightiest men in the kingdom, though she is far too young yet to understand what that will come to mean. Her name is Philippa. She has been born into the house of Lancaster, into wealth and blood and expectation beyond the imagining of ordinary people, and the strange and remarkable journey of her life is only just beginning. Let us draw back the curtain of the centuries. Then, as softly as a nurse drawing a blanket over a sleeping child, and step into the age into which she was born. To understand Philippa, we must first understand the house into which she came, for it shaped everything that she was and a great deal of what she would become. Her father was John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the greatest nobleman in England and one of the richest men in all of Europe. A son of the old king, Edward III, and a younger brother to the famous warrior men called the Black Prince. Through her father ran the royal blood of the Plantagenets, the line of kings who had ruled England for 2 long centuries, and through her mother ran the vast inheritance of Lancaster, a treasure of castles and estates and revenues so great that it made her father a prince in all but name. She was, in short, as nobly born as any woman in England who did not herself wear a crown, the granddaughter of a king, the daughter of a duke who would come to dream of being a king in his own right. And the world watched such a child almost from her cradle, wondering what marriage, what alliance, what distant throne might one day be raised upon her small and unknowing head. It is hard, at this distance, to grasp quite how mighty the house into which Philippa was born truly was, for her father stood so high above the ordinary run of nobles that he was less a subject than a prince in his own right. The lands and revenues he held through his marriage made him the richest man in England, by far master of a scattered empire of castles and manors and towns that stretched across the length of the kingdom from the northern moors to the southern shires. And to these vast estates he joined the blood of kings, being a son of the reigning monarch, and for much of his life the effective ruler of the realm in all but name. Men feared him and courted him and hated him. The crowds of London, in one terrible rising, burned his splendid riverside palace to the ground. And through it all he moved as one of the mighty powers of the age, a shaper and unmaker of policy, a claimant to a foreign throne, the towering figure at the centre of his daughter's early world. To be the child of such a man was to grow up amid a magnificence that beggars description, moving with the household between one great castle and another as the seasons and the business of the duchy required. There were the mighty northern strongholds, with their curtain walls and their soaring keeps, and the softer manners of the Midlands, and the lost glory of the riverside palace in the capital. The most sumptuous private dwelling in the land before the mob put it to the torch, and through all of them flowed the endless traffic of a princely household. The hundreds of servants and officers and retainers, the guests and the messengers, the wagons of goods and the trains of horses, the whole vast machinery of a family that lived like royalty, because it very nearly was. In this world of stone and splendour and ceaseless movement, Philippa passed her childhood. A small figure in a mighty machine, learning without knowing, she learned it the manner and the bearing and the expectations of the very highest rank. And yet for all its grandeur, it was not a soft or an idle world, for the House of Lancaster prided itself upon more than mere wealth, and there ran through it a strong vein of seriousness, of duty, of religion, and of learning that marked it out among the leading households of the age. Philippa's grandfather, the first Duke of the line, had been a famous soldier, and also a thoughtful and devout man who wrote a book of religious meditation with his own hand. Her father, for all his worldly ambition, was a patron of scholars and reformers and a man of real, if complicated, piety. And the household as a whole was a place where books were valued and faith was taken seriously, and the education of the young was not neglected. It was a fortunate thing for Philippa that this was so, for it meant that the qualities native to her own grave and thoughtful nature found, in the house of her childhood, encouragement and nourishment rather than neglect. And the woman who would one day reform a foreign court and raise a golden generation of princes was formed at the deepest level by the serious and high-minded traditions of the English house that made her. Her mother was Blanche of Lancaster, a woman remembered by those who had known her as gentle and fair and good, and it is one of the quiet mercies of history that we know a little of her still. For one of the finest poets of that age set down his sorrow at her passing in verses that have survived to this very day. But that sorrow was still to come. In Philippa's earliest years, her mother was a living presence, the still centre of the whole household, and the small girl grew in the shelter of that presence through the earliest seasons of her life. One child, among several in the crowded, glittering, and perilous life of a medieval ducal court. She had a younger brother, a boy named Henry, who would one day seize the crown of England itself and reign as its king. She had a sister as well. And other infants came and went in the nursery as infants did in those years. Some living, some slipping away in their first months into the small graves that every family of the age knew far too well. This was the childhood that was hers, privileged beyond measure, and yet touched, as all lives then were, by the constant nearness of loss. Blanche of Lancaster, Philippa's mother, deserves to be remembered for herself, and not only as a figure of loss. For she was one of the great heiresses of her age, and by every surviving account, a woman of rare sweetness and worth. She was the daughter, and in the end, the sole heiress of the first Duke of Lancaster, the celebrated soldier and statesman who had served the old king so long and so well. And when she married Philippa's father, a lesser son of the crown, with his own way yet to make, she brought to him the whole immense inheritance of Lancaster, and with it the wealth and the standing that would make him the mightiest magnate in the land. It was, in the cold terms of the age, a spectacular match, but it seems also to have been, which was rarer, a genuinely happy one, a marriage of real affection between two people finely suited to each other. Of Blanche herself the records tell us tantalizingly little, and yet what little there is glows with an unusual warmth, for those who wrote of her goodness. She was praised for her beauty, which seems to have been considerable, fair-haired and fair-skinned in the manner the age admired. But more than her beauty, men remembered her character, her gentleness, her piety, her kindness, the sweetness of a nature that drew love to her wherever she went. She was the still bright centre of her husband's household in the early years of their marriage, and she bore him several children in the few years they had together, of whom Philippa was among the eldest to survive. And for that handful of years the House of Lancaster was crowned by a duchess, whom everyone, from her husband to the humblest servant, seems genuinely to have loved. Then, when Philippa was still a small child, Blanche was gone, carried off young by the sickness that spared no rank, and the light went out of that household in a way that was long remembered. Her husband's mourning became almost legendary. He kept the anniversary of her death with solemn observance for the rest of his life, and founded prayers for her soul, and could not, it was said, easily speak of her, and though he married twice more, for policy and for ambition, it was beside Blanche, in the end, that he chose to be buried. For Philippa, the loss of such a mother, at such an age, was the first great sorrow of her life, and perhaps the seed of much that she became. For children who lose a gentle mother, young often carry that loss as a kind of inward compass, and grow up gentle and grave and dutiful, as if to keep faith with the one they can barely remember. The loss came when Philippa was still a small girl, no more than 8 winters old, and it came in the way that so much death came in those centuries, swiftly and without warning, on the breath of the plague. Her mother Blanche, still young, and by every account lovely, sickened and died within a matter of days, and the bright centre of the household was simply gone, leaving a grieving widower, a scattering of motherless children, and a silence where a gentle presence had been. We can only guess at what such a loss meant to a child of that age, too young to understand and too old not to feel it. But we know that it marked the whole family deeply, and that her father's grief was famous. So deep that he could scarcely bear to speak of it for years afterward. There is a dark thread that runs through the entire length of Philippa's days, from their beginning almost to their end, and it is worth drawing out, for it shaped her in ways both obvious and hidden. That thread was the plague, the great mortality that hung over the whole of her age, like a pall that never lifted, striking without warning and without mercy, sparing neither the high nor the low, and carrying off in a matter of days those who had been well and hale an hour before. It was that sickness that had taken her gentle mother from her when she was a small child, tearing the bright centre out of her earliest world, and it would be the plague, at the very last, that would take Philippa herself, in the season of her greatest hopes. The sickness bracketed her span, striking at its dawn and at its close, a grim and constant presence against which all her wealth and all her rank could offer no defence at all. Between those two blows, the shadow was always there, for the pestilence came and went through the years of that age like a recurring tide, and no one, however great, could feel safe from it. It emptied cities and scattered courts. It struck down the strong and the young as readily as the old and the weak. It turned a healthy household into a house of mourning in the space of a week. Philippa passed all her life in the knowledge of this ever-present danger, and it touched her again and again in the losses of her own infant children, in the deaths of those around her, in the constant nearness of an end that no care could keep away. To live in that age at all was to live in the constant nearness of sudden death. And Philippa, who had felt its weight from her earliest childhood, carried that knowledge with her all her days. It would be easy to think that such a shadow must have darkened her entire spirit, and yet the truth seems to have been the opposite. For the nearness of the grave did not make her fearful or despairing, but rather deepened and steadied the faith that was her strength. A woman who knew how quickly all could be taken away held the more firmly to the things that death could not touch. A soul that had learned early how fragile all earthly joy was fixed itself the more securely upon eternity. Her deep religion was not one senses, a thing apart from the sorrows of her days, but grew in part out of them, out of the early loss and the constant danger, as a tree driven by hard winds sends its roots the deeper. The darkness that lay over her age did not break her. It made her strong and grave and ready when her own time came to meet it without fear. And so, when the sickness came for her at the last in that fatal season by the sea, she was not unprepared, for she had lived her whole life under its threat and made her peace with the mortality it preached. The sickness that had opened her life with the loss of her mother closed it with her own death. But between those two dark points she had built an existence so full of faith and purpose and love that the shadow could not darken it. And she met it as she had met everything, with the steady courage of a soul secure in its God. The plague had the first word in her story and the last. But the story itself, all that lay between, was one of light shining in the shadow, of a course lived well and fully under the constant threat of death, and that, perhaps, is the truest measure of her strength. Out of that grief came something rare and beautiful, for the Duke, in his mourning, turned to a young poet then rising in his service, and the poet answered the sorrow of his lord with a work of tender and dreaming beauty. A vision of a knight in black, wandering a forest, and mourning a lady of surpassing goodness, fair and true and lost. That poet was Geoffrey Chaucer, whose name would one day be remembered as long as English itself was spoken, and the lady of surpassing goodness was Philippa's own mother, set down in verse, so that she might not be wholly lost to time. It is a strange and moving matter to think of, that the mother, whom Philippa lost as a child, lives on, faint and golden, in some of the earliest and most beautiful lines of English poetry, mourned by a stranger's art, even as she was mourned by her own small daughter in the nursery of a cold northern castle. The elegy that Philippa's mother inspired deserves a place in her story, for it is a work of real and lasting beauty, and it opens a window onto the cultivated world in which the future queen was raised. The poet who wrote it was then a rising man in royal service, not yet the towering figure he would become, but already possessed of the gift that would make him the father of English poetry, and moved, it seems, by the Duke's terrible grief. This writer composed a dream vision in the fashion of the age, a tender and melancholy work in which the dreamer wanders into a spring forest and comes upon a knight clothed all in black, sitting alone and grieving, who tells him of the peerless lady he has loved and lost. The lady of the verse is all goodness and grace and beauty, the very flower of womanhood, and in mourning her the Black Knight mourns, unmistakably, the Duke's own lost Blanche. It is a strange and haunting thing to hold in the mind, that a mother lost to a small girl in a cold castle should live on, 6 centuries and more later, in some of the earliest and loveliest verse in the English tongue, her sweetness fixed forever in a young poet's lines. It does not name her plainly, in the courtly manner of such works, but weaves her name and her virtues into its imagery, so that those who knew could not mistake her. And it turns a private grief into a public and enduring monument, a memorial in words more lasting than any tomb of stone. Through that poem, the gentle Duchess reaches us still, faint and golden across the centuries, more real to us in her goodness than 100 better documented queens. And the poem tells us something too, about the world of Philippa's childhood, for a household that could inspire and cherish such a work was a household in which the things of the mind and the imagination were honoured. The House of Lancaster was a place of poets and books and learning, as well as of arms and estates, a court where a gifted new writer could find a patron and a hearing, where the making of fine things was valued alongside the winning of battles and the gathering of lands. In such an atmosphere, the young Philippa breathed in, along with her piety and her sense of duty, a love of letters and of the life of the mind that she would carry with her all her days, and would one day plant, along with so much else, in the distant southern kingdom she was to rule. The girl who grew up in the house that Chaucer served became, in her turn, a queen who honoured learning and raised bookish and thoughtful sons. And the thread runs back, unbroken, to the cultivated English world of her earliest years. After such a loss, the children of a mighty house were not left untended, for a princely household like that of Lancaster was a small kingdom in itself, full of servants and officers and gentlewomen whose whole business was the care of the Duke's children. Into the place of chief care for the motherless girls came a young widow of the establishment, a woman named Catherine, quick and warm and capable, who took charge of Philippa and her sister, and became, in the years that followed, the closest figure to a mother that the growing girls would know. This Catherine was no ordinary servant, for she was clever and charming and of gentle birth, and in time she would come to hold a place in that household stranger, and greater than anyone could then have foreseen. But to the young Philippa she was, first and above all, the steady hand that guided her girlhood, the woman who taught her and watched over her and shaped the manners and the mind of the future queen. The woman who took chief charge of the motherless Philippa deserves a chapter of her own, for she was one of the most striking figures of the age, and her own extraordinary story wound closely about the story of the girl she raised. Her name was Catherine, and she came of modest but gentle stock, the daughter of a herald from the Low Countries who had come to England in the old Queen's train. She had married early to a knight of his following, and been left a widow while still herself in her prime, with children to raise, and her own way to make in the world. Into the household of Lancaster she came, and into the care of the Duke's daughters, and there she showed herself so capable, so charming, and so warm that she rose quickly in trust and favour, becoming the governess and guide of the small Philippa and her sister. But Catherine's rise did not stop there, for she was a person of unusual gifts, and in time she came to hold a place in the Duke's own heart. She became his mistress, and bore him a family of children over the years, a second shadow family growing up beside his lawful one. And though such an arrangement was common enough among the great, what followed was not. For the Duke's love for her proved deep and lasting, and did not fade with the years. After his second wife died, and against all the expectations of the age, he did the extraordinary thing of marrying Catherine, raising the herald's daughter and former governess to be Duchess of Lancaster, one of the first ladies of the realm. And their children, born out of wedlock, were made legitimate by king and pope alike, and went on to found a great line of their own. For Philippa, all this meant that the woman who had mothered her in childhood became also in time her stepmother and a duchess, and that the children of that union were her own half-brothers and half-sister, bound to her by blood and by the shared memory of the household that had raised them. It was a tangled and a very human family, the House of Lancaster, full of love and ambition and irregularity, of losses and second marriages and children of many kinds. And Catherine, rising from governess to duchess across the years, was one of its most vivid figures. That such a woman had the shaping of Philippa's girlhood can only have enriched it. For whatever else she was, Catherine was warm and wise and worldly wise. And the grave and gentle child in her charge grew up under the care of one of the ablest women of the age. Under such care, Philippa grew into a child of real and unusual seriousness, for everything we know of her later life tells us that her childhood must have planted deep the qualities that came to define her. She was schooled, as a lady of her rank must be, in all the accomplishments of her rank, taught to read and to sew, to bear herself with dignity, to understand the ordering of a noble house and the duties that would one day be hers. But beyond these, she took into herself something graver and more lasting, a genuine and abiding devotion, a faith that was not merely the outward observance expected of the great, but a true and inward faith that would govern the entire conduct of her life. We may wonder where it came from, this deep religious seriousness that marked her out even among the pious people of a pious age. Some of it sprang perhaps from her own nature, some from the loss that had touched her so young, and some, it may be, from the currents of reform and inquiry that ran through her father's household. For the Duke was a protector of scholars and preachers who questioned the easy ways of the church, and a thoughtful young soul in such a house might well have grown thoughtful about the things of the soul. The girlhood that shaped Philippa deserves a closer look, for it was in those early years, in the mighty households of her father, that the entire cast of her character was set. And the woman who would reform a court and raise a golden brood was formed by the schooling of her English youth. She was taught, as a daughter of the highest nobility, all the accomplishments proper to her rank, to read and to write, to sew and to embroider with exquisite skill, to bear herself with the dignity her station demanded, to sing perhaps and to know something of music, to speak with grace and to comport herself as a great lady must. But her education went beyond these surface graces, for it was the way of her family to take the training of the mind and the soul seriously. And the young Philippa was given a grounding in letters, and in faith that went deeper than the ornamental learning thoughts sufficient for most noble women of the age. The household in which she grew was, for all its worldly magnificence, a place of unusual religious seriousness and intellectual ferment, for her father, whatever his faults and his ambitions, was a patron of scholars and reformers, some of whom questioned boldly the corruptions and the easy ways of the church of their day. There moved through the Lancastrian world men of learning and of conscience, preachers who called for a purer and simpler faith, thinkers who set the authority of Scripture above the accumulated customs of centuries. And a grave and thoughtful girl, growing up in that atmosphere, could hardly fail to absorb something of its earnestness, its hunger for a religion of the heart rather than of mere form. Whether or not Philippa embraced the boldest of these ideas, she breathed in from her earliest years the conviction that faith was a serious and inward and demanding thing, not a matter of outward show, and that conviction became the bedrock of her whole life. Out of this schooling, and out of her own grave nature and her early sorrow, there grew the character that would define her, a rare union of qualities that set her apart even in girlhood. She was devout without being narrow, disciplined without being cold, learned without being proud. She had a strong and settled will, a deep and genuine piety, a love of order and of letters, and a warmth of heart beneath her gravity that drew love to her. All the elements were there in the English girl of Lancaster that would flower in the Portuguese queen. The faith that would astonish a foreign court, the discipline that would reform it, the love of learning that would enrich it, and the strength of character that would carry her, alone and unafraid, across the sea to a strange throne and a strange people. The making of the queen was the work of that English girlhood, and when she sailed south at last, she carried all of it with her, folded away inside her like a seed. It is worth pausing on this, for it reminds us that the golden generation of Portugal and the age of discovery that flowed from them had their most distant root in the schoolrooms and chapels of the English line of Lancaster, in the grave and serious upbringing of one motherless girl. The qualities she would plant in her sons were the qualities that had been planted in her. The ideals she would teach them were the ideals she had learned, and the vast edifice of her Portuguese achievement rested at bottom, upon the foundation laid in her English childhood. She was in the deepest sense a product of her upbringing, and a triumphant one, and to understand what she became, we must never forget what she was made of, and where and how she was made. Whatever its source, that seriousness set her apart, and it went hand in hand with a discipline and an order of mind that would later astonish the people of the distant land she was to rule. She was not cold by any account, but warm and dutiful. Yet there was in her, even young, a gravity, a sense of how things ought to be done, and a will to see them done that way. That would in time reshape an entire royal court in her image. All of this, though, lay far ahead. For now she was simply a daughter of Lancaster, growing up in the tall castles of her father, in a childhood of privilege and piety and quiet grief, waiting, as all such girls waited, for the one question that hung over every noble daughter of the age to be answered, the question of whom, and when, and to what end she would be given in marriage. The marriage was a long time coming, longer by far than anyone would have expected for a daughter of such a house. For a girl of Philippa's rank was a prize in the endless game of alliances, her hand a piece to be played for the advantage of her family, and by rights she ought to have been betrothed young and wed not long after. Yet the seasons passed, and the proposals came and went, and still she remained unmarried, until she had grown from a girl into a woman well past the age at which most brides of her rank were already wives and mothers. Match after match was spoken of, and considered and let fall, undone by the shifting winds of politics, by the changing fortunes of her father, by the endless calculations of a world in which a marriage was never a matter of the heart, but always of policy. And so she waited, season upon season, watching her youth quietly pass while the men who governed her fate turned their vast designs this way and that. There is something quietly poignant in the long years of Philippa's waiting, for she was a woman whose whole future hung upon decisions made by others, and who watched, through no fault of her own, the ordinary lot of her rank slip further and further out of reach. A princess of her birth ought to have been a wife before she was well out of girlhood, and a mother soon after. That was the pattern, the expectation, the plain purpose for which such daughters were raised. Yet match after match was mooted and pursued and let fall, brought down by the shifting tides of politics, by wars and alliances, and the endless recalculation of advantage, until Philippa had passed clean through the years in which a bride of her rank was normally settled, and stood, still unwed, in an age and a place where an unmarried woman of nearly 30 was a thing almost unheard of among the great. What she felt through those years we can only imagine, for she left no record of it, keeping her own counsel as she kept it all her life. But it can have been no easy thing to watch the seasons pass, to see younger women married and mothers while she remained a daughter in her father's house, to know herself a piece endlessly moved about the board of diplomacy and never yet played. There must have been hope and disappointment, and hope again, as one prospect rose and fell and another took its place. There must have been the quiet indignity of being valued only for the alliance she could bring, and passed over as that alliance ceased to suit. And there must have been, too, the growing question of whether she would be married at all, or left at last upon the shelf, a spinster princess, her purpose unfulfilled. And yet when we look at what her waiting finally brought, it is hard not to see in it a strange providence. For had she been married young to one of the princes proposed for her in her girlhood, she would have led some other life entirely, and the golden destiny that was in fact hers would never have come to be. It was because she was still unwed in her maturity, a woman grown and formed and ready, that she was available when the one chance came, when a throne in the far west fell open and an alliance was wanted to seal it. And she came to that marriage not as a frightened girl, but as a finished woman, wise and grave and equal to the enormous task before her. The long waiting that must have seemed at the time a kind of failure was in truth the making of her, and the very delay that cost her her youth gave her, in exchange, the readiness that made her great. Philippa was not the only daughter of her line to be raised up to a throne, for the blood of Lancaster was carried, in her generation, onto more than one royal seat, and the tale of her sisters is worth telling. For it shows how the endless game of dynastic marriage scattered the children of one English duke across the courts of Europe. She had a full sister, near her own age, with whom she had shared the losses and the schoolrooms of their childhood, and who was married in time to a powerful English lord close to the royal house, taking her place among the foremost ladies of her native land. But it is the fate of her half-sister that most strikingly mirrors her own. For that younger girl, the daughter of their father's second marriage, was destined to become a queen in the very land next door to Philippa's own. So that two sisters of one house wore the crowns of two neighbouring kingdoms at the same time. That half-sister was the child of their father's Castilian marriage, and through her the long and costly dream of the Castilian throne was at last brought to a kind of fulfilment, though not in the way the Duke had first intended. When the attempt to win Castile by the sword had failed and a settlement was made, it was sealed by the marriage of this daughter to the heir of the very throne her father had claimed. And so the girl went, as Philippa had gone, to a foreign Iberian court, to become in time the queen of a broad Spanish realm and the mother of its kings. The blood of Lancaster, which could not take Castile by conquest, entered it instead by marriage, and sat upon that throne in the person of the Duke's daughter and her descendants after her. It is a remarkable thing to consider, these daughters of one English house set upon the thrones of the peninsula, Philippa in Portugal and her half-sister in Castile, two sisters reigning as queens in two rival kingdoms that lay side by side. They had grown up together, or nearly so, in the households of their father, and they ended as crowned queens in neighbouring lands, each the mother of a royal line, each carrying the blood and something of the character of Lancaster into the heart of a foreign realm. Between their two kingdoms there was often rivalry and sometimes war, and yet upon both thrones sat a daughter of the same English duke, a strange and striking testimony to the reach of one mighty family's marriages. For Philippa, the knowledge that her own sister reigned in the kingdom next door must have been a comfort and a complication, both a familiar tie in a foreign world and a reminder of the tangled loyalties that bound the royal houses of the age. The daughters of Lancaster had been sent out, as such daughters were, to be the seals of alliances and the mothers of dynasties, and they had risen, by the accidents of birth and marriage and their father's grand ambition, higher than almost any women of their generation, to be queens in a foreign land. Philippa's story is the greatest of theirs, for the sons she bore outshone all the rest. But she was not alone in her royal destiny, and the crown she wore in Portugal had its sister crown in Castile, both of them set, by the workings of policy, upon the brows of the Duke of Lancaster's daughters. Chief among those designs was her father's consuming dream, for John of Gaunt had come to want, more than almost anything on earth, a crown of his own. Through his second marriage to a princess of Castile, he had gained a claim to that broad Spanish kingdom, and he styled himself its king and set his heart upon making the title real. And much of the delay in Philippa's marriage, much of the manoeuvring of that time, turned upon her father's hope of winning by arms the throne he claimed by right of his wife. To that end, he needed friends and allies in the peninsula, beyond the mountains, and above all he needed the friendship of the one kingdom There that was Castile's ancient rival and enemy, the small, tough, seafaring realm that lay along the Western Ocean, the realm of Portugal. Her father's Castilian dream shaped so much of her fate that it is worth understanding in itself, for it was one of the grand obsessions of the age, and it drove the whole train of events that carried her to Portugal. Some years after the death of her own mother, the Duke had married again, and this second marriage was pure policy, for his new wife was a princess of Castile, the daughter of a king of that land who had been overthrown and killed by a rival half-brother. Through her, the Duke inherited a claim to the throne of Castile itself, one of the mightiest crowns in Europe, and he seized upon that claim with all the force of his ambitious nature, styling himself king of the distant land and setting his heart, for years on end, upon the winning of it. A vast and glittering ambition it was, and it hung over the whole family, for a man who called himself a king could not rest until he had made the title good, and the pursuit of that crown coloured every calculation of the Duke's diplomacy. His daughters became pieces in that great game. Their marriages weighed for the advantage they might bring to that venture, and it was in the service of it, above all, that the Duke at last gathered his forces and sailed for the peninsula, meaning to march into that kingdom itself and take by the sword the throne he claimed by right of his wife. Philippa sailed with that expedition, and Philippa's marriage to the King of Portugal was, in its origin, a move in her father's Castilian game, a way of securing the ally he needed for his march upon the Spanish kingdom. In the end, the shining dream came to nothing, or nearly nothing, for the winning of that throne proved beyond even the Duke's resources. The campaign faltered, sickness and hardship wore down his army, and the throne he coveted stayed out of his grasp. But he was too shrewd a man to come away with empty hands, and the affair was settled at last, as so many were, by a marriage and a payment of money. Another of his daughters, Philippa's half-sister, was wed to the Castilian heir, so that the Duke's blood would sit upon that throne after all, in the next generation, if not in his own, and the Duke renounced his claim in return for a great sum and an honourable peace. The Castilian dream died, but out of its long pursuit had come, almost as a byproduct, the thing that mattered most for our story, the marriage of Philippa to Portugal, and all the golden history that flowed from it. Portugal in those years had won for itself, against terrible odds, a hard and glorious independence. Its throne had passed in a time of confusion to a man of courage and ability, and when the full power of Castile came against him to press another claim, the Portuguese had met the invaders upon a field in the heart of their country, and though vastly outnumbered, had broken them utterly. In that famous victory, the Portuguese had been helped by a company of English archers, whose deadly arrow storm had done fearful work against the Castilian knights. And out of the shared blood of that battlefield, and the shared enmity toward Castile, there grew a friendship between England and Portugal that would be sealed in the most solemn form the age knew, a treaty of perpetual alliance between the two crowns, an alliance so enduring that it lives on, unbroken, to this very day. The kingdom to which she came had been forged only a few years before her arrival in one of the most remarkable feats of arms of that century, and the memory of that deliverance was still fresh and glowing in the land she was to rule. Portugal had fallen into a crisis of succession when its old king died, leaving no son, only a daughter married into the royal house of Castile. And rather than pass under the rule of their great and grasping neighbour, the little nation had rallied, in a surge of stubborn patriotism, behind a man of their own royal blood, though born outside wedlock, the master of a knightly order, who would become their king. Castile, determined to enforce its claim, poured an army across the border, vastly greater than anything Portugal could muster, and upon a ridge in the heart of the country the two forces met, in a battle upon which the whole future of the little kingdom hung. Against every expectation, they won, and won overwhelmingly. Their leaders had chosen their ground with care and drawn up their smaller force in a strong defensive position, and among them stood a company of English archers, whose long bows sent such a storm of arrows into the packed ranks of the advancing enemy that the vast Castilian host was thrown into confusion and then into ruin. By the day's end, the invading army was broken and fleeing, its chivalry destroyed, its threat to the kingdom's freedom ended for a generation, and the master of the order who had led the defence was confirmed by that victory as the undoubted king of an independent Portugal. It was a deliverance so complete and so unlooked for that it passed at once into the national memory as a kind of miracle, the day on which little Portugal had defied the giant and prevailed. That victory was the foundation upon which everything else in her Portuguese life was built, for it had made her husband a king in fact as well as in name, and it had bound the fate of the realm to the friendship of England, whose archers had helped to win the field. The king never forgot the debt, and in thanksgiving for his triumph, he vowed to raise a soaring abbey upon the spot, the soaring golden church that would one day hold his tomb and Philippa's, so that the victory which secured his crown, the marriage which sealed his English alliance, and the resting place which would receive them both at the last, were all bound together in a single thread of providence. Philippa came, in short, to a kingdom that had just been born again in blood and glory, a proud and grateful and hopeful land, ready to receive as its queen the daughter of the nation that had helped to set it free. And that alliance, in the manner of the age, was to be bound and sealed by a marriage. For treaties written on parchment were well enough, but a treaty written in blood and kinship was stronger still. The King of Portugal, the brave and able man who had won his throne upon the battlefield, was without a wife, and the great English Duke, seeking a firm ally for his Castilian venture, had a daughter still unwed. And so, at last, after all the years of waiting, Philippa's fate was settled. She was to go to Portugal and marry its king, and become the queen of that far western land, binding her father's English house to the Portuguese crown in the strongest bond that two royal families could make. The alliance that Philippa's marriage sealed was no ordinary treaty, and it deserves a moment's wonder, for it has proved one of the most enduring bonds in the whole history of nations. England and Portugal, two seafaring realms upon the Atlantic edge of Europe, had drawn together out of shared interest and shared enemies, and in the years around Philippa's marriage they pledged themselves to each other in the most solemn form the age could devise. A treaty of perpetual friendship and mutual aid, each pledged to stand by the other against all comers for all time to come. It was sworn and sealed with every ceremony that could give it weight, and confirmed in the fashion of the age by the marriage of the English Duke's daughter to the Portuguese king, so that the tie between the two crowns should be one of blood as well as of parchment. What no one who swore that treaty could have known was how long it would last, for the friendship it declared has endured through every change and chance of the centuries, from that far-off age down to our own day, making it the oldest alliance in the world that is still in force. Empires have risen and fallen, whole ways of life have passed away. The very map of Europe has been redrawn again and again. And through it all, the old friendship between England and Portugal has held, invoked and honoured across 600 years and more, a living link back to the age of Philippa and her king. There is something moving in the thought that a promise sworn to seal a medieval marriage should still be binding upon nations today, long after the castles have crumbled and the crowns have passed away. And Philippa herself was the living seal of that alliance, the human bond in which the treaty was made flesh, for in her person the two kingdoms were joined as closely as two kingdoms can be. She was English by birth and blood and upbringing, and Portuguese by marriage and by choice and by the whole second half of her life. She carried the one nation into the other, and made of her own body and her own family the meeting point of the two. Her sons would be half English and half Portuguese, the grandchildren of an English duke and the heirs of a Portuguese king, and through them the blood of Lancaster would run in the veins of Portugal's royal house for generations. The alliance was written on parchment and sworn upon holy relics. But its truest and most lasting expression was Philippa herself and the remarkable family she was to raise. To bring it about, her father gathered a mighty expedition, an army and a fleet, and set sail for the peninsula to press his Castilian claim with the help of Portugal, and Philippa sailed with him, leaving behind the grey castles and the green rain-washed hills of the England she had known all her life, bound for a country she had never seen, to wed a man she had never met. We should pause a moment upon that voyage, for it was no small matter. She was a woman of the cold and northern island, raised among its mists and its stone halls, and she was carried now down the length of the Western Ocean, past strange coasts, into warmer and brighter and less familiar seas, toward a land of white towns and blazing sun and a tongue she did not speak. Everything she had known was behind her, everything before her was unknown, and whatever fear or hope or grief she felt as the English coast sank away behind the ships, she kept, as she kept so much, to herself. When at last the ships came into the Portuguese coast, and the strange new land rose up before her, green and gold under a southern sky, Philippa stood upon the edge of the whole second half of her life. Behind her lay the daughter of Lancaster, the motherless English girl, the bride too long unwed. Ahead of her lay the queen she was about to become, and the country she would come to love, and the children not yet born who would make her name immortal. She was past her youth now, grave and disciplined and deeply devout, no dazzled young girl, but a woman grown, who understood exactly what was being asked of her and meant to do it well. And what was being asked of her was nothing less than this: to leave her own people forever and give herself, body and soul, and for the rest of her days, to a foreign land and an unknown king and a destiny she had not chosen but would not refuse. The voyage that carried Philippa out of England and down toward her new life was itself an ordeal and an adventure, for sea travel in that age was slow and perilous and deeply uncomfortable. And to commit oneself to the open ocean was to place one's life in the hands of wind and weather and the skill of rough seamen. The ships of the time were small and heavy and clumsy by our reckoning. High-sided wooden vessels that wallowed rather than sailed, driven by a single great square sail and steered by an oar or a rudder at the stern, with little room aboard and less comfort. Into such vessels went the whole apparatus of the expedition, the soldiers and the horses, the arms and the stores, the lords and the ladies and the servants, packed close in the dark and cramped spaces below the decks. And among them went Philippa, a duke's daughter bound for a throne, sharing in all the hardship of a medieval sea crossing. They sailed from the western ports of England out into the open Atlantic, and at once the true nature of the voyage made itself felt. For the seas off that coast are rarely kind, and the crossing of the wide bay that lay between England and the peninsula was a byword for storm and sickness. The ships rose and plunged over the grey swells, the timbers groaned, and the sails cracked in the wind, and below decks the passengers endured the misery of the sea, the pitching and the rolling, the sickness that spares neither rank nor sex, the cold and the wet, and the endless uneasy motion. For a woman raised on solid ground, however high her birth, it can have been no small trial to be shut for days in a heaving wooden box upon a hostile ocean, not knowing from hour to hour whether the next storm might send them all to the bottom. And yet the voyage was more than an ordeal, for it was also a passage between two worlds, a slow unspooling of the miles that carried Philippa out of all she had known and toward all that was to come. Day by day the ships worked their way south, and the very air and light began to change. The grey northern skies gave way, in time, to a harder brightness, the cold to a growing warmth. the familiar shores of home to strange new coasts, rising blue and unknown out of the sea. She was leaving behind not merely a country, but a whole existence. The England of her birth and her childhood and her unwed years. And she must have felt, as the last of the northern shore dropped below the horizon, the full weight of what she was doing, the finality of it, the knowledge that she would, in all likelihood, never see her native land again. Whatever she felt, she bore it as she bore everything, with a composure that gave little away, setting her face toward the future and the duty that awaited her. She had passed, in those days at sea, a kind of threshold, passing out of one half of her days and into the other. And when at last the ships came in toward the shore of the peninsula, and the mountains of the new land stood up at last against the southern sky, she was ready as a woman could be, to become the thing she had been sent so far to be. The daughter of Lancaster had gone aboard in the cold northern harbour. The Queen of Portugal, in all but the actual ceremony, stepped ashore upon that far bright coast, her old life behind her upon the water, her new life waiting on the land. The landing itself, after so long at sea, must have come as a blessed relief. The solid earth, strange and swaying underfoot after the endless motion of the deck. The sounds and smells of a foreign shore crowding in upon senses grown used to nothing but salt and wind. Around her spread a country utterly unlike her own, brighter and harsher and more vivid, its people dark and quick and speaking a rapid, unfamiliar tongue. Its very light and heat a kind of foreignness pressing upon her from every side. She had arrived. The long voyage was over, and before her, no longer a distant rumour, but a solid and immediate fact, lay the kingdom she had crossed to rule, and the king she had come to wed. The wedding took place in the depth of a Portuguese winter, in the old grey cathedral of the northern city that climbed in tiers of white houses above the mouth of a broad river, and it was as grand an occasion as the young kingdom could make it. The city gave itself over to festival for the coming of its queen, the narrow streets hung with cloths and greenery, the bells ringing out over the red roofs, the people crowding to see the English princess who had sailed so far to be their king's wife. And there, in the candlelit dimness of the great church, before the assembled lords and prelates of Portugal, Philippa of Lancaster was married to the king, and became, in that hour, the Queen of Portugal, a title she would carry with grace and gravity for the rest of her days. The city in which Philippa was married was one of the oldest and proudest in Portugal, a place of steep streets and stone houses climbing in tiers up the hillsides above the mouth of a broad and rushing river, where it poured at last into the ocean. It was a town of merchants and mariners, hard-working and independent-minded, long accustomed to the sea and the trade that the sea brought, and it had been a stronghold of support for the new king in the late struggle, so that it was fitting that his English bride should come to it to be wed. As the day of the wedding approached, the whole town made ready to receive its queen, and to celebrate, in the depth of winter, the marriage that would bind their king to the mighty realm across the sea. For the citizens it was an occasion of enormous pride and excitement, the coming of a foreign princess of famous lineage to be their sovereign lady, and they spared no effort to do her honour. The narrow streets were cleaned and decked, hung with rich cloths and green boughs and whatever finery the townsfolk could muster. The church bells rang out across the red-tiled roofs, and the people crowded every window and doorway and vantage point to catch a glimpse of the northern lady who had sailed so far to marry their king. There would have been processions and music and the roar of the crowd. The whole town turned out in its best to witness the day. And through it all moved Philippa, grave and dignified and gorgeously arrayed, a stranger being welcomed with open arms into the heart of her adopted land. The wedding itself was celebrated in the ancient cathedral that stood high upon the hill, a stern and massive church of grey granite that had watched over the city for centuries. within its dim and solemn interior, lit by the flames of many candles and filled with the great men and women of the kingdom in their richest attire. Philippa of Lancaster was joined in marriage to the King of Portugal, with all the solemnity that church and crown could bring to bear. The vows were exchanged, the blessings pronounced, the union sealed before God and the assembled realm, and when the pair emerged at last from the great doors of the cathedral, they came forth as king and queen together, husband and wife. The alliance made flesh, and the long years of Philippa's waiting brought at last to their fulfillment. The celebrations that followed were as lavish as the young kingdom could contrive, days of feasting and revelry and rejoicing to mark the royal wedding. There were banquets in the high halls, and music and dancing, and the giving of gifts, and all the display of magnificence with which the age loved to hallow such occasions. For a royal marriage was not merely a private joining, but a public triumph, a demonstration of the wealth and the dignity and the hope of the crown. And at the centre of it all was Philippa, no longer a duke's unmarried daughter, but a crowned and wedded queen, taking up in those festive days the place and the honour and the burden that she would carry for the rest of her life. Yet beneath the rejoicing there must have been, for Philippa herself, a great deal to take in, for she was a bride among strangers, in a strange city, at the head of festivities conducted in a tongue she did not yet speak, married to a man she had known only a matter of days. However splendid the welcome, she was still profoundly alone in her new grandeur, the one northern figure in that southern crowd, embarking upon a marriage and a queenship in a land where everything was new to her. That she carried herself through it all with such grace and such command speaks of the strength that was in her. For even in that first bewildering rush of ceremony and celebration, she was already, unmistakably, a queen. The man she married was worth the marrying. He was a king who had won his throne rather than inherited it, a bold and able and energetic man in the prime of his life, who had come to power in a time of danger and had proved himself in war and in rule alike. He had not been born to be a king, and there was in him something of the self-made man, a vigour and a directness and a shrewd practical sense, and he had already shown, in the winning and holding of his crown, a courage and a capacity that made him one of the more remarkable rulers of his age. To this seasoned soldier king came now out of the north a grave and cultivated and deeply pious English princess, older than the usual run of royal brides, formed and finished and wholly her own woman. And from the meeting of these two very different people there grew, against every expectation, of an age that asked nothing of marriage but alliance and heirs, one of the great royal partnerships of the medieval world. The king that Philippa married had come to his throne by a road that no one could have foreseen, and his story is worth telling, for it explains much of the man he was and much of the country he had made. He had not been born to rule, nor even born in wedlock. He was a son of an earlier king of Portugal, but a son outside marriage, raised to be the master of a great religious and knightly brotherhood rather than a candidate for the crown. For most of his early years, the throne was as far from him as it was from any other nobleman of the land, and he might have lived and died a lord of that brotherhood, remembered by history only in passing, had not the sudden failure of the royal line thrown the whole land into crisis and opened, to his own astonishment perhaps, an unlooked-for path to power. When the old king died, leaving only a daughter married into the hostile house of Castile, and the kingdom faced the prospect of passing under foreign rule, it was this master of the knights who became, almost by accident and then by desperate choice, the champion of Portuguese independence. He struck down the powerful favourite who stood in his way, was acclaimed by the people of the capital, and took up the defence of the realm against the Castilian invasion, and when, against all odds, the great victory was won and the invaders driven out, the grateful nation made him its king setting the crown upon the head of the illegitimate son who had saved it. It was a remarkable rise from the master of an order to the founder of a royal dynasty, and it had been earned by courage and decision, and the favour of fortune in a moment of supreme danger. The man who emerged from that ordeal was every inch a king, though a king of an unusual and self-made kind. He was able, energetic, and shrewd, a capable soldier, and an even more capable ruler, with the practical good sense of a man who had made his own way, and the firm grip of one who knew how nearly he had lost everything. He set about the work of governing his hard-won kingdom with vigour and intelligence, restoring order after the years of war, rewarding those who had stood by him, and laying the foundations of the long and prosperous rule that lay before him. He was pious in the manner of his age, generous to the church, a builder of monasteries in thanksgiving for his triumphs, and he had, along with his soldiers' hardness, a real appreciation for learning and for the finer things, which made him a fitting match for his cultivated English wife. Before his marriage he had lived, as men of his rank and time commonly did, and he had children already born outside wedlock, whom he acknowledged and provided for, and who would play their own parts in the history of the realm. But with his marriage to Philippa, a change came over his private conduct. For he gave himself to his wife with a fidelity that was remarked upon precisely because it was uncommon among kings, honouring her and keeping faith with her through all the long years of their union. Whether this was the effect of her grave and commanding character, or of his own respect for the remarkable woman he had wed, or simply of a genuine love that grew between them, we cannot say. But the fact of it is plain. And it speaks well of them both, and it made possible the deep and fruitful partnership that was to be the making of their house. For theirs became, against every expectation, a true meeting of minds and purposes. The self-made soldier king and the cultivated northern princess, labouring together over the decades to build something finer than either alone. He brought the vigour and the practical genius and the hard-won crown. She brought the gravity, the learning, the disciplined piety, and the shaping of the extraordinary children who would carry their house to glory. It was a marriage that began in the cold calculation of policy and grew into one of the most fruitful royal partnerships of the medieval age. And at its heart, quiet and steady and strong, was Philippa, the Englishwoman who had crossed the sea to become the mother of a dynasty. For their marriage, begun as a matter of pure policy, a bargain between kingdoms, became in time a thing of real and abiding regard. The king, who like most men of his rank and time, had known other loves before his marriage, gave himself after it by every account wholly to his wife, honouring her and heeding her and keeping faith with her in a manner remarkable enough that men remarked upon it. And she, for her part, gave him a loyalty and a devotion and a steady partnership in the work of ruling that made her not merely his ornament, but in a real sense his fellow labourer. Theirs was not a marriage of grand romance in the way the poets sang of, but something quieter and perhaps rarer, a marriage of deep, mutual respect that ripened into genuine affection, and that held firm and unbroken until death itself came at last to part them. But all that lay ahead, and in those first days Philippa was a stranger in a foreign land, and it can have been no easy thing. She had come to a country warmer and brighter, and altogether different from her own, a land of white towns and terraced vineyards and a hard blue sea, where the sun beat down in a way her northern skin had never known, and the very smells and sounds and colours of life were foreign to her. The people about her spoke a tongue she did not yet understand. The food was unfamiliar. The customs new, the whole texture of daily life unlike anything she had grown up with. And she was queen of it all, set at the head of a court she did not yet know, watched by a people curious to see what manner of woman their king had brought home from the far north. Many a woman would have been overwhelmed by such a beginning, but Philippa was not. For there lay in her a steadiness and a resolve that no strangeness could shake, and she set herself, from the first, to learn her new country and to master her new place. The country that Philippa had come to was, in almost every particular, the opposite of the one she had left, and the strangeness of it must have pressed upon her in those early days from every side at once. She had been raised in a land of grey skies and green fields, of soft rain and gentle light, and a cool, damp air that hung about the stone castles of the north. And she found herself now in a region of hard, bright sun and deep blue skies, where the light fell with a clarity and a force she had never known, where the summers blazed with a heat that her northern blood found almost fierce, and where the very earth was different, tawny and dry, and terraced into vineyards and olive groves upon the steep hillsides. The rivers ran down through gorges to a restless ocean. The towns climbed white and close upon their hills, and over it all lay a quality of light and warmth and vividness that made the England of her memory seem, by comparison, a place of shadows. The people, too, were unlike her own, quicker and darker and more openly warm, given to a directness and a passion of manner that the reserved English found startling, and they spoke a rapid, musical, unfamiliar tongue that she could not at first understand at all, so that in the midst of her own new court she was, for a time, almost deaf and dumb, dependent upon interpreters and gestures and the slow, patient work of learning. The food was strange to her palate, the oil and the garlic and the fish, the fruits she had never tasted, the wine of the country, the customs of daily life ran along different channels, even the rhythm of the hours. The late meals and the heat of the afternoon was other than she was used to. Everything conspired to remind her, in those first months, that she was a foreigner in a distant land, cut off by sea and language and custom from all that had made her. And yet Portugal had its own real beauty and its own deep appeal, and Philippa was too intelligent and too large of soul not to come, in time, to love it. There lay a grandeur in that hard, bright landscape, a splendour in the blazing skies and the terraced hills and the endless ocean. There was a warmth in the people, once the barrier of language fell, that answered something in her own affectionate nature. And there was, in the vigour and the hope of that young rising kingdom, something that a woman of her energy and ambition could give her heart to. She bent herself to master the country as she mastered everything, patiently and thoroughly, learning its tongue and its ways until she could move through it with ease. And the land that had been so strange to her became over the years her own, the home of her heart and the country of her children, and the place where she would live and die. For that was the deepest truth of her situation, that she had not come to Portugal as a visitor, but as a queen, to stay, for the whole of the rest of her life. There was no going home for her, no return to the green, rain-washed island of her birth. She had crossed the sea once and for all, and given herself wholly to this bright, hard, beautiful land. And she knew it, and so she did not stand apart, as a lesser woman might have done, clinging to her foreignness and pining for the north. She gave her heart to Portugal, learned to be a Portuguese queen, and poured her whole formidable self into the making of a life and a family and a legacy in her adopted country. The strangeness that had pressed upon her at first became familiarity, and then affection, and then a deep and settled belonging. And the Englishwoman who had stepped ashore so alien and alone grew into the beloved queen of a people who came to think of her, in the end, as entirely their own. And master it she did, though it took time, as such things do. She learned the language of her adopted land, and its customs, and the tempers and factions of its court. She came to know its lords and its ladies, its bishops and its cities. She studied, with the patient thoroughness that was so much a part of her, the whole intricate machinery of the kingdom she had married into, until in time no one could have called her a foreigner any longer. She grew, in the fullest sense, into a Portuguese queen, loved and honoured by the people she had come to rule, and yet she never ceased, in some deep chamber of her heart, to be also the daughter of Lancaster, the Englishwoman, carrying into her southern kingdom the manners and the faith and the settled habits of the northern island that had made her. It was this doubleness, perhaps, that made her so remarkable a queen, for she brought to Portugal something it had not had before, a note of northern gravity and order and disciplined piety, and wove it into the warmer fabric of her adopted land. The particular inheritance that Philippa carried south was a rich and specific one, and it is worth naming what it was that England gave, through her, to Portugal. There were the forms and rhythms of English devotion, the particular way of keeping the offices and the feasts that she had learned in the chapels of her childhood. There were the standards of the great northern households, their order and their ceremony and their grave decorum. There was a whole manner of conducting a royal court, dignified and disciplined and serious, that she had absorbed in the house of Lancaster and now transplanted into her adopted kingdom. These were not trifles, but the very texture of a culture, and she wove them, thread by thread, into the daily round of the Portuguese royal house, so that the life of that court came to carry, unmistakably, the stamp of the far island that had formed its queen. This doubleness, this being at once wholly Portuguese and enduringly English, was one of the secrets of her peculiar quality as a queen, for she stood at the meeting point of two worlds and drew strength from both. To the warmth and vigour and brightness of the south, she joined the gravity and discipline and order of the north. To the passion of her adopted people, she lent the steadiness of her own. And out of that blending came something finer than either alone, a court and a family that united the virtues of two nations. Her children, of English blood on the mother's side and southern on the father's, grew up conscious and proud of their double inheritance, taught to honour the English descent that ran in their veins and the English alliance that their mother embodied. And they carried that pride, and the temper it shaped, into everything they did. The bond with England, indeed, was a living thing in that Portuguese court, kept warm by the presence of the English queen at its heart, and it coloured the outlook of the sovereign house she founded. Her sons looked to England as their mother's country, and their own by right of their mother's blood. They cherished the alliance she had sealed. They bore, some of them, the names of English kings and English forebears, a living reminder of the northern inheritance that was half their own. Through Philippa, in short, England and Portugal were joined not merely by a treaty of state, but by the intimate bonds of blood and character and shared tradition. And the line of Avis, for all that it was, of the south to the core, carried within it, through its English mother, a strong and honoured strain of the northern island she had left. It is a striking thing to consider that so much of what made that royal house great in its day was at bottom an English importation, carried south in the person of one remarkable woman. The gravity, the discipline, the bookishness, the high seriousness of purpose that marked the children of Philippa, and that set them apart from the ordinary princes of the south, were qualities their mother had brought from England and bred into them, and the shining achievements that flowed from those qualities were, in a real sense, the fruit of that English inheritance transplanted. Philippa was the channel through which the character of one nation flowed into the reigning house of another, to its lasting enrichment. And the age of glory that Portugal was about to enter owed more than it ever knew to the grave Englishwoman who had come across the sea and made herself its queen. While Philippa was making her life as a queen in the far south, an even more extraordinary destiny was unfolding for her younger brother, back in the land of her birth, a destiny that would set the crown of England itself upon the head of her own family. The boy who had shared her nursery grew into a bold and able and ambitious man, and in the turning of events he was driven into exile by the King of England, his cousin, and his great inheritance was seized. But he did not tamely accept his ruin. He returned, in a season of discontent, at the head of his supporters, and in a swift and stunning stroke he overthrew the reigning king and took the throne for himself, founding upon it the royal line of his blood. The Duke of Lancaster's son became the King of England, and Philippa, far away in Portugal, found herself the sister of a reigning English monarch. It was a breathtaking rise, even for so mighty a house, for the crown of England was no small prize, and to seize it, as her brother did, was to change the whole course of his country's history. From that bold usurpation there flowed consequences that ran on for generations. Wars and rivalries and the long struggle over the throne that would trouble England for the better part of a century. But in the immediate moment, it meant that the line of Lancaster, Philippa's own kin, had risen from a dukedom to the very summit of royal power. He reigned as king, his son after him would reign in turn, a famous warrior king whose victories would ring through Europe, and the blood of Lancaster, which sat upon the thrones of Portugal and Castile through the duke's daughters, sat now upon the throne of England itself through his son. For Philippa, this transformation of her family's fortunes must have been a source of pride and of wonder, watched from a distance across the sea. The family into which she had been born, already among the greatest in England, had become in her own lifetime a royal house, a dynasty of kings, and she, its daughter, was queen of one kingdom, sister to the king of another, and half-sister to the queen of a third. Few women of any age have stood at the centre of such a constellation of crowns, bound by blood to the thrones of three kingdoms at once. And it speaks of the extraordinary height to which her family had climbed, that a daughter of it should find such royalty on every side of her, in a brother, in a sister, and in herself. And yet for all the glory of her English family's rise, Philippa's own path had led her elsewhere, into a life and a destiny quite her own. Far from the intrigues and the battles of the English throne, he had won a crown by boldness and by force. Her half-sister had gained one by the settlement of an old claim. But Philippa had made her greatness, not by seizing a throne, but by the quieter work of a marriage, a court, and above all, a nursery. And the sons she raised would leave a mark upon the world deeper than any crowned king of her line. The daughter of Lancaster, who had gone south to Portugal, had in the end the most lasting greatness of them all. And while her brother's dynasty rose and fell in the wars of England, the dynasty she founded in Portugal went on to open the whole world. It is worth pausing to consider what manner of woman Philippa was in herself, as those who knew her saw her. For behind the achievements and the influence there was a real human person, and the impression she made upon her contemporaries was strong and clear and consistent. She was, by every account, a woman of grave and dignified bearing, of a presence that commanded respect without demanding it, carrying herself with the settled assurance of one who was entirely certain of who she was and what she believed. There was nothing frivolous or shallow about her, nothing of the vain or the trifling. She was serious, composed, and self-possessed, a figure of natural authority whose very manner declared the strength and the seriousness of her character. Yet she was not cold, for all her gravity, and those who came to know her found beneath the dignified surface a real warmth, a genuine kindness, a capacity for affection and for care that won her deep and lasting love. She was gentle with those who needed gentleness, merciful to the suffering, warm to her family and her friends. Her sternness was reserved for matters of principle and for the government of her own conduct, and it was tempered always by a deep kindness of heart. It was this union of gravity and warmth, of strength and tenderness, that made her so remarkable and so beloved, for she inspired both respect and affection. and those about her both revered and loved her. She was the kind of person whose virtue was felt as a presence, a steadying and warming influence upon all who came within her orbit. Her contemporaries remembered, too, her piety, which was the most marked of all her qualities, and the one that impressed itself most deeply upon those around her. In an age of easy and outward religion, hers was manifestly deep and true, a faith that governed her whole life and shone through her whole conduct, and men recognized in her a sanctity that went beyond the ordinary, a holiness almost. That set her apart from the common run even of pious queens. She was held up, in her own day and long after, as a model of what a queen and a Christian woman ought to be. Her name a byword for virtue and devotion and wifely and motherly excellence, and the reverence in which she was held was the natural tribute of an age to a virtue it recognized as real. Such was the woman at the centre of our story, the grave and gentle and formidable English queen who reshaped a court, raised a golden generation, and blessed from her deathbed the venture that opened the world. She was not a warrior or a conqueror, not a maker of laws or a wager of wars. Her greatness was of a quieter and a deeper kind, the greatness of character, of influence, of the patient shaping of others toward the good. And yet her mark upon history is as deep as that of many a king who filled the chronicles with his battles. For through the children she made and the ideals she planted, she reached forward to touch ages she never saw. To know her, even a little, across the long gulf of the centuries, is to feel the presence of a truly noble and truly great woman, and to understand why those who knew her loved her, and why her memory has never wholly faded from the land she made her own. For she did not merely adapt herself to Portugal, she set about quietly and firmly, and over many years, to shape Portugal to herself, or at least to shape the court and the family at its heart. The realm she had come to was young and vigorous and a little rough, its court less polished and less ordered than the great households of the north, and into it Philippa brought her own high standards, her own sense of how a royal house should be run, her own grave and disciplined and devout example. What she made of the court, and of the remarkable children she was to bear, is the true heart of her story, and it is there that we are going now. The court that Philippa took in hand was a lively and a worldly place, as the courts of victorious young kings tend to be, and by the standards she had brought with her from the disciplined households of the north, it wanted ordering. She set about that ordering, not with harshness, but with a quiet and unbending firmness, raising by her own example the whole moral tone of the place, until the court of Portugal became known, in her time, as one of the most decorous and well-governed in Europe. She would not tolerate about her the loose manners and easy morals that were common enough in the courts of the age. She required of those around her a seemliness and a restraint that reflected her own. And because she asked nothing of others that she did not first and more strictly ask of herself, her example carried a weight that mere command could never have had. Slowly, steadily, the court remade itself in her image, becoming graver, cleaner, more ordered. A fit setting for the remarkable family that was to be raised within it. It is worth looking more closely at how a single woman could remake the manners of a whole court, for Philippa achieved it without any of the instruments of command, working only through the force of her own example. A foreign queen could not simply decree the morals of a nation, nor did she try. Instead, she held herself to a standard so high and so unwavering that those about her were first shamed and then drawn into imitation, following her lead toward a graver and cleaner way of life. She required of her own attendants a strictness of conduct that mirrored her principles. She would not suffer near her the loose talk and the careless morals that passed for normal in the courts of the age. And slowly, by the sheer steady pressure of her presence, the manners of those around her began to bend toward her own. It was a reform accomplished not by rule, but by radiance. The quiet conquest of a court by one woman's unbending example. The particulars of her reform touched every corner of court life, from the greatest matters to the least. She insisted upon a seemliness of dress and of manner, a restraint in speech and in behaviour, a proper observance of religion, and an ordering of the household's whole daily round upon disciplined and decent lines. Where before there had been perhaps a certain rough looseness, the careless morals and coarse pleasures of a court of fighting men, there came now, under the Queen's steady hand, a gravity and a refinement and a cleanness of manner that transformed the whole character of that household. The court became known, in her day, as one of the most virtuous and best ordered in Europe, a reputation it owed almost entirely to the example and the influence of its English queen. None of this was achieved by harshness. For that was not Philippa's way, and she ruled her court, as she ruled her children, by love and example far more than by command. She was firm, unbendingly firm, in the standards she held to, but she was warm as well, and just, and kind, so that those about her followed her lead, not from fear, but from a kind of reverence, drawn by the plain goodness of her conduct toward a better way of being. It is a rare thing to reform a whole court, and rarer still to do it by gentleness rather than by force. But that was Philippa's achievement, and it speaks of a moral authority so complete that she could remake the manners of a court simply by living day after day as she believed one ought to live. And the reform outlasted her, as such things do when they are rooted in true example rather than mere rule. For the tone she had set held on after she was gone, and the court she had shaped kept something of her stamp for long years afterward. She had given the ruling house of Portugal not only a line of remarkable children, but a character, a standard of conduct and of seriousness that became part of its inheritance. And the decorum and the piety and the high seriousness that she planted in that court were among the least visible, but not the least real of her gifts to her adopted land. In reforming the court she had, in a sense, reformed the very heart of the kingdom, for the court was the pattern that the whole realm looked to. And in raising its tone, she had raised a little. The tone of a nation, at the heart of everything she did, lay her faith, which was the governing principle of her whole existence, deep and genuine and woven through every hour of her day. She rose early to her prayers and kept the holy offices with the devotion of a nun, hearing Mass daily, observing the fasts and the feasts of the Church with exact and loving care, and giving to her private devotions a time and an attention that would have done credit to a cloister. Hers was no cold or merely dutiful religion, but a living thing, the true centre of her life. And it shaped not only her hours of prayer, but the entire conduct of her days, her charity, her justice, her patience, her unwearied sense of duty. In an age when the piety of the great was often more show than substance, Philippa's was the real thing, and those who lived near her knew it and were the better, many of them. For the knowing, to picture Philippa in the ordinary round of her days is to see a life of remarkable order and discipline, for she governed her hours as strictly as she governed everything else, and the pattern of her days was shaped, above all, by her devotions. She rose early, while much of the court still slept, and gave the first hours of the morning to prayer, keeping the holy offices of the church with a regularity that a religious house might have envied. And through the day, at the appointed hours, she returned again and again to her devotions, so that her whole day was strung, like beads upon a thread, upon the recurring times of prayer. Mass she heard daily, and never lightly or in haste, but with a real and inward attention, and the great feasts and fasts of the Church's year she observed with exact and loving care, so that the calendar of her faith was the true frame of her existence. Around this framework of devotion She wove the business of a queen and the mistress of a great establishment. For she was no idle contemplative, but an active and capable woman with a royal household to order. There were the affairs of her own household to oversee, the servants and officers and ladies to direct, the accounts to watch, the endless small decisions of a great establishment to be made. There were her children, whose upbringing she supervised with a close and constant care that we shall come to. There was her needlework, at which she and her ladies laboured, for the making of fine and holy things by hand was thought a fit occupation even for a queen. And there was her reading, for she was a lettered woman who fed her mind as faithfully as she fed her soul. Every hour had its purpose and its place, and idleness, that old enemy of the disciplined, found little room in her ordered days. Nor was her day given over wholly to prayer and household and study, for a queen had public duties too, and Philippa performed them with grace and gravity. She kept her state as the occasion required, presiding at the ceremonies of the court, receiving those who came to her, lending her presence to the high occasions of the realm. She gave counsel to her husband, who valued her judgment and consulted her in matters of weight. And she attended always to the works of charity that were so central to her sense of what a queen should be. Seeing to the relief of the poor and the care of the sick as a daily part of her duty. Hers was a full day and a purposeful one, every part of it turned towards some worthy end, with no room for the idle pleasures in which the great so often wasted their hours. And through it all there ran a spirit of self-command that was the very signature of her character, a steady mastery of her hours that lent her whole existence a quality of calm and ordered purpose. She was not driven or anxious in her discipline, by every account, but serene, moving through her ordered hours with a settled tranquillity that came, one senses, from the deep security of her faith. For a woman whose life was built so wholly upon her religion had a still centre that the storms of the world could not easily reach. To those around her, she must have seemed a figure of extraordinary steadiness, always composed, always occupied, always turned toward duty and toward God. And the example of that ordered and devoted life did more, perhaps, than any command could have done to raise the tone of the court she governed and to shape the children she was rearing. It was a manner of living that would have done credit to a saint, and indeed there was in Philippa something of the saintly, though joined to a thoroughly practical capacity for rule and for motherhood that no mere recluse could have matched. She proved, in her own person, that the deepest piety and the most active competence could dwell together in one soul, that a woman might give her mornings to God and her days to the ordering of a kingdom and the raising of princes, and do all of it well. That union of the devout and the capable was the secret of her power, and it was written into the very pattern of her days, from the first prayer at dawn to the last at night. And it was this, above all, that she passed on to the remarkable children who grew up watching their mother live. Out of that faith flowed a wide and constant charity, for she held, as the truly devout have always held, that religion untranslated into kindness is worth little. And she gave, freely and continually, to the poor and the sick and the unfortunate of her adopted land. She fed the hungry at her gates, tended in her own person to the sick, supported religious houses and good works, and made of her queenship an instrument of mercy as well as of majesty. The poor of Portugal came to know her as a friend and to bless her name, and long after her death the memory of her goodness lingered among the common people, who had found in their foreign queen not a distant and gilded figure, but a woman of real and active compassion, whose hands were open to their need. Of all the aspects of Philippa's queenship, none endeared her more to the people she ruled than her charity, for she made of her riches and her position an instrument of active mercy. And the humble folk of Portugal came to love her as few queens have been loved. She held, with the whole force of her deep religion, that those whom God had set high were bound to succour those he had set low, and that a queen's riches were a trust to be spent, in no small part, upon the relief of the needy, and she acted upon that belief, not now and then in showy gestures, but steadily, daily, as a settled habit of her life. The hungry were fed at her gates, the naked clothed, the sick tended. And behind these acts lay not the cold duty of a great lady discharging an obligation, but the warm compassion of a woman who genuinely cared for the wretched and the poor. Her charity took many forms, for she was thoughtful as well as generous, and sought to do good in ways that lasted. She gave alms freely and continually to the poor who came to her. She supported hospitals and houses of religion, endowing the work of mercy so that it might go on beyond her own giving. She took a special care for the plight of portionless girls of good character who lacked the means to marry, providing dowries so that they might make honest matches. A form of charity peculiarly close to the heart of a woman who understood how much a woman's fate hung upon her marriage. She interested herself in the welfare of the common people of her adopted land, in their hardships and their needs, and she used her influence with the king, always on the side of mercy and good governance. A gentle and steadying hand upon the exercise of power. There was nothing distant or condescending in her care for the poor, for she brought to it the same personal attention she brought to everything, and did not shrink from the sight and the touch of suffering. It was said of her, as it was said of the holiest queens of the age, that she tended the sick with her own royal hands, that she did not hold herself above the meanest of God's children, but served them as though she served Christ himself in them. And whether or not every such story is exactly true, they tell us truly how she was regarded, as a queen whose compassion was real and active and humble. The common people are shrewd judges of the great who claim to love them, and they do not lightly give their hearts. That they gave their hearts so wholly to Philippa is the surest proof of the genuineness of her charity. There was, in the gratitude of the poor for Philippa, something that reached beyond the ordinary thanks given to a generous patron, for they seemed to have loved her as a person and not merely as a benefactress, drawn by the plain kindness that shone through all her giving. The bread and the alms and the tending were real and welcome, but what won their hearts was the spirit behind them, the sense that this great foreign lady genuinely saw them, genuinely cared, genuinely counted their hardship as her own concern. It is a rare thing for the very great and the very poor to meet in real affection, divided as they are by so vast a gulf of circumstance. Yet Philippa bridged that gulf by the simple force of a loving spirit, and the humble of her adopted land gave her, in return, a devotion that no wealth could have bought. In her charity, as in all things, it was the woman herself, and not merely her rank or her riches, that drew the love of those she served. Nor was she only pious and charitable, for she was learned too, in a degree unusual for a woman even of her rank. And she brought to Portugal a love of books and of learning that helped to enrich the culture of her adopted court. She loved reading, and encouraged it in others. She valued scholarship and the making of books. She carried into her southern kingdom the intellectual currents of the north, the taste for letters and history and devout study that she had breathed in from her cradle in the house of Lancaster. Under her influence and her husband's the Portuguese court became a place where learning was honoured and the mind was cultivated, and the children she was to raise there would grow up steeped in books and ideas as few princes of the age were. Formed by a mother who believed that a great prince must be a thoughtful one. Among the many gifts that Philippa brought to her adopted country, not the least was a love of letters and study, for she was a lettered and thoughtful woman in an age when many even of the great could barely read. And she carried into the Portuguese court an intellectual seriousness that helped to enrich its whole common life. She had grown up, we must remember, in a household where letters were honoured, where poets found patrons and manuscripts were prized, and the life of the mind was not despised, and she brought that inheritance south with her, along with her faith and her discipline, and planted it in the soil of her new kingdom. Volumes in that age were rare and costly things, each one copied out by hand upon fine skins, bound and sometimes gorgeously illuminated. Treasures that only the wealthy could gather, and Philippa gathered them, and pored over them, and set a value upon them that those around her learned to share. Her reading was of the serious kind that befitted her character, running above all to the works of religion and devotion that fed her faith, the scriptures and the writings of the Holy Fathers and the lives of the saints, but reaching also to history and to the moral and improving literature that the age produced. She did not read merely for idle pleasure, as one might turn to a romance to pass an empty hour, but for the nourishment and the shaping of her mind and soul, and she encouraged the same serious reading in those around her, above all in her children, whom she raised to prize the written word as she prized it. Under her influence, the making and gathering and study of fine volumes became a marked feature of the Portuguese court, so that the household she governed grew into a place of real learning as well as of piety and good order. The fruits of this were most visible in her sons, who grew into some of the most cultivated princes of their age, steeped from childhood in reading and ideas as few of their rank ever were. The eldest, who would be king, proved a genuine author, writing works of grave reflection in his own hand. Another stood out as a famous patron of scholarship and translation, gathering scholars about him and enriching the letters of his country. And all of them carried through their lives the mark of a bookish and thoughtful upbringing, the stamp of a mother who had taught them that a prince should feed his mind as well as train his body and guard his soul. In an age of fighting men who scorned the pen, the sons of Philippa stood out as warriors who were also scholars, men of action who were also men of thought. And that rare union was their mother's doing. There is something fitting in the thought that a woman of the land of Chaucer, raised in a house where English poetry was born, should have carried the love of letters across the sea and planted it in a kingdom that was about to embark upon the boldest voyages of discovery the world had ever seen. For the bold enterprise of Portuguese exploration was not merely a matter of ships and sailors and courage, but also of study, of the gathering of knowledge, the making of charts, the study of the stars and the winds and the shape of the world. And the studious seriousness that Philippa had helped to plant in her sons bore fruit in the next generation, in a spirit of patient inquiry that sent men out to map the unknown. The mother who loved her reading helped, in her quiet way, to make possible the age in which her son would gather the map makers and the stargazers and open the road around the world. In all of this, she worked closely with her husband the king, for theirs was in the truest sense a partnership, and he valued her counsel and leaned upon her judgment in matters far beyond the ordering of the household. She was no mere consort, kept for ceremony and childbearing, and set aside from the real business of the realm. She was a true helpmeet in the work of rule, trusted and consulted and heeded. Her steady sense and her wide learning and her deep principle brought to bear upon the governance of the kingdom. The king had won Portugal by the sword, but it was in no small part the queen who helped to give it in the years of peace that followed. The order and the dignity and the moral seriousness of a settled and civilized realm. Together they made of Portugal something finer than either could have made alone, and together they founded a royal house that would carry the name of Avis into glory. Philippa was far more than a decorative consort or a mere bearer of heirs, for she was, in the truest sense, her husband's partner in the work of ruling, and her weight in the councils of the kingdom was real and acknowledged. The king had won his crown by his own courage and held it by his own ability, but he was wise enough to know the value of the grave and thoughtful woman he had married, and he leaned upon her judgment, sought her counsel, and heeded her voice in matters far beyond the ordering of the household. She was no silent ornament at his side, but a trusted adviser whose good sense and wide reading and settled principle made her opinion worth having. And in a marriage that was in every way a joining of equals in spirit, she bore her full share of the burden and the business of the crown. Her influence was felt, above all, upon the side of just governance and of mercy, for she brought to the counsels of a warrior king the steadying voice of conscience and moderation. Where the impulses of power ran toward harshness, she urged clemency. Where they ran toward rashness, she counselled prudence, and her presence at the king's side was a constant gentle pressure toward justice, toward mercy, toward the wiser and the kinder course. It is impossible now to measure exactly how much of the sound order and the settled peace of her husband's long reign was owing to her influence, for such things leave little mark upon the record. But those who knew that court had no doubt that the Queen's hand, though it worked quietly and behind the scenes, was a real and beneficent force in the governing of the realm. She served, too, as a kind of living bond within the royal house, and beyond it, a reconciler and a peacemaker whose gentleness and good sense could soften quarrels and heal breaches. In the tangled world of a medieval court, full of rivalries and factions and wounded pride, such a figure was of enormous value, and Philippa filled that role with a grace that won her the trust of all parties. Her known integrity, her freedom from faction and self-seeking, her evident concern only for the right, gave her a moral authority that few could match, and men turned to her as an honest broker and a fair judge, confident that her counsel would be disinterested and her word to be relied upon. In a world of intrigue, she was that rarest of things, a great personage whom everyone believed to be honest. All of this she did without ever overstepping the bounds that her age set upon a woman, for she wielded her influence not through office or command, which were closed to her sex, but through counsel and example and the quiet arts of persuasion. She ruled, in effect, by being trusted, by being heeded, by being the conscience at the king's ear, and the steady hand upon the tiller of the household, and through it, of the realm. It was a queenship of substance, not of show, and it made her a real force in the history of her adopted country. A partner in the building of the strong and settled and civilized kingdom that her husband's reign became. The soldier had won the crown, but it was the scholar queen at his side who helped him to wear it well, and who lent to his rule the gravity and the mercy and the moral seriousness that were her own great gifts. Yet, for all her public works and her weight in the councils of the kingdom, the truest and most lasting labour of Philippa's life was carried on within the walls of her own household, in the raising of her children. For it is, as a mother, above all, that history remembers her, the mother of a family of princes so gifted and so remarkable that their own countrymen came to speak of them with a kind of wonder. That family, and the extraordinary care she lavished upon its shaping, is the very heart of her story, and it is there that we must turn now into the nursery and the schoolroom of the Portuguese royal house, to watch a great queen at the work she did best of all. The children came, as children did, over the years of her marriage, and not all of them lived. For even a queen could not keep her little ones safe from the perils that carried off so many infants of the age. She bore a first daughter who did not survive, and a first son who was lost as well, and she knew, as almost every mother of that century knew, the particular grief of standing beside the small coffins of her own flesh. And yet out of those losses, and past them, there came at last the children who lived, and who would justify beyond all measure the care and the hope she poured into them. There were sons, chiefly, a whole row of remarkable boys, and one daughter who survived to greatness. And taken together, they made up a family so gifted, so various, and so distinguished that the Portuguese, looking back, would call them by a name that has clung to them ever since, and speak of the children of Philippa as the Illustrious Generation, the golden brood of the House of Avey. The bearing and rearing of children was, for a queen of that age, both her first duty and her constant peril, and Philippa's seasons of motherhood were shadowed, like those of every woman of the time, by the ever-present nearness of death. She had married late by the standards of her day, a woman already well into her 20s, and she gave herself to childbearing through the seasons that followed with the same devoted thoroughness she brought to everything, bearing child after child across her married years. But not all of those children lived, for the perils of the cradle were terrible in that age. And even the warm and well-tended nursery of a queen could not keep out the sicknesses and the frailties that carried off so many of the very young. She knew more than once the particular anguish of losing an infant she had carried and borne and begun to love, of seeing a little life flicker and go out despite every care. And she bore those losses as she bore all things, with a grief that was deep but not despairing, upheld by the faith that was her strength. The dangers were not to the children alone, for childbirth itself was among the chief killers of women in that age, sparing neither the poor nor the great. And each confinement that Philippa entered was a venture into real and mortal danger. A queen went into her lying in as into a kind of battle, from which she might not emerge alive, and more than one royal lady of the age paid for the bearing of an heir with her life. And Philippa faced that danger many times over across her years of motherhood, going down again and again into the shadow of the childbed in the hope of new life. That she came through it so often and lived to see her children grow was a mercy not granted to every queen, and the price she paid, in pain and fear and the wearing of her body, was the hidden foundation upon which the glory of her family was raised. For the children who lived, the nursery of a royal house was a world of its own, an establishment of nurses and rockers and attendants set apart under the mother's eye, where the precious young lives were tended with every art that the age could contrive. Philippa, unlike many great mothers of her time, did not hold herself aloof from that world, content to leave her children wholly to hired hands. She took a close and constant interest in their tending and their earliest shaping, watching over the nursery with the same attentive devotion she brought to all her duties. From their very earliest days, she was a real presence in her children's lives, not the distant and gilded figure that many royal mothers were, but a watchful and devoted parent who meant to have a hand in the making of her sons and daughters from the cradle up. It is this, above all, that sets Philippa apart among the royal mothers of her age. This refusal to leave the shaping of her children to chance and to servants, this determination to mother them herself in the fullest sense. She understood, as few in her position did, that the years of childhood are the years in which a character is formed, and she meant to form the characters of her children with her own hands and by her own example. And so she made of the nursery and the schoolroom the chief theatre of her life's work, and lavished upon it the intelligence and the principle and the patient devotion that were her greatest gifts. The losses she suffered there only deepened her tenderness for the children who remained, and out of that care, sustained across all the seasons and all the sorrows, came the extraordinary family that was to be her monument. Consider what those children became, and remember always that it was their mother, more than any other single hand, who shaped them. The eldest of the sons who lived grew into a thoughtful and bookish and conscientious man who would in time succeed his father as king, and who wrote, in his own hand, a book of grave and searching reflection upon the duties and the sorrows of a ruler. one of the most humane and thoughtful works to come from any crowned head of the age. The second became a famed traveller, a wanderer over the whole face of the known earth, who journeyed to the far courts of Christendom and beyond, and came home laden with learning and experience. A soldier and a scholar, and one of the most cultivated princes in Europe. And the third, quietest and most inward of them all, would set in motion something that changed the history of the entire world, for it was he who gathered about him the sailors and the mapmakers and the stargazers, and sent ship after patient ship, creeping down the unknown coast of Africa, into seas no European had sailed, and so opened the door to the great age of discovery that would carry European sails around the globe. Consider first the two eldest of the sons who lived, for they were remarkable men, and they show us plainly the kind of prince that Philippa's mothering produced. The eldest, who bore the name of his great English forebears and would one day succeed his father as king, grew into a man of unusual thoughtfulness and conscience, grave and studious and burdened, almost, by his own high sense of duty. He was no mere warrior prince, though he could fight when he must. He was a thinker, a reader, a writer, who set down in his own handbooks of grave reflection upon the duties and the difficulties of a ruler and upon the ordering of the inner life works of real wisdom and real feeling that reveal a mind of rare seriousness. In him the bookish and dutiful strain of his mother ran strongest of all, and he wore his coming greatness, not as a triumph, but almost as a weight, a trust to be discharged with anxious care. And though his reign, when it came, would be short and troubled, the man himself stands out among the kings of his line for the depth and the humanity of his character. The second son was a figure of a different stamp, more restless and more adventurous, one of the great travellers of the age, who was not content to stay at home in his own country, but must go out and see the wide world for himself. He journeyed far and wide across the face of Christendom to the courts of distant kings and emperors, to strange lands in the east and the north, gathering everywhere knowledge and experience and honour, until he was reckoned one of the most widely travelled and most cultivated princes in all of Europe. He came home laden with the fruits of his wanderings, with books and maps and knowledge and the wisdom of far places, and he became a patron of scholarship and a promoter of the very spirit of inquiry and discovery that was about to make his family and his country famous. In him his mother's love of learning was joined to a bold and questing spirit that carried it out into the world. These two, the thoughtful heir and the questing traveller, were only the eldest of the remarkable brood, but they show us already the pattern of the whole, the union of high principle, deep reading, and bold endeavour that marked the children of Philippa and set them apart from the ordinary princes of their time. And behind both of them, plainly, stood their mother, whose stamp they bore in everything, the one in his grave and bookish conscience, the other in his learning and his reach, for it was she who had filled their minds with knowledge and their hearts with high ideals, and sent them out to be the finest kind of men. They were, each in his own way, exactly what she had laboured to make them, and in their achievements and in their characters we read the success of her long and patient work. Their later lives would carry them into greatness and into sorrow both, as the lives of such men so often do, for the heir would come to a troubled throne and an early death, and the traveller would rise to rule his country, and then fall in the bitter strife that so often follows greatness. But all that lay far ahead, in a future their mother would not live to see. In her lifetime, they were her promising, brilliant sons, the eldest jewels of her illustrious brood. Growing toward the greatness she had raised them for, she had made them well, and she knew it, and the pride she took in them, those grave and gifted young men, must have been among the deepest joys of her later years. Of all the sons of Philippa, it is the third who has left the deepest mark upon the history of the world, though he was in his own person the quietest and most inward of them all. A grave and austere and deeply religious man who never married and cared nothing for the ordinary pleasures of a prince. He was not a conqueror in the common sense, nor a famed captain of armies, nor a ruler of men. His greatness lay in a single steady aim that he pursued year upon patient year, until it changed the shape of the known world. For it was he who conceived the idea, and found the means, and supplied the unwearied will to send ship after ship out into the unknown ocean, down the long uncharted coast of Africa, into seas that no vessel of his people had ever sailed, in a patient and deliberate reaching out toward the undiscovered that opened, in the end, the whole age of discovery. He gathered about him, in his stronghold by the southern sea, the men and the knowledge that such a venture needed, the sailors and the shipwrights, the map-makers and the astronomers, the pilots who knew the winds and the currents. And under his direction, the craft of navigation was slowly perfected. New kinds of ships devised that could beat back against the wind. New charts drawn as each voyage pushed the known coast a little further south. Voyage by voyage his captains crept down that endless shore, past the cape that mariners had always feared as the end of the sailable world, and on beyond it into waters no one had mapped, bringing back each time a fresh reach of knowledge. A further stretch of coast, a new tract of the unmapped made known. It was slow and costly, and often disheartening, for the sea gave up its secrets grudgingly. But he never faltered, and the patient pressure of his will carried his ships ever deeper into uncharted waters. His motives were mingled, as men's motives are, and it would be false to paint them all as pure. There was in his enterprise the old crusading zeal, the desire to strike at the power of the unbeliever and to spread the Christian faith. And there was the hope of commerce and of the wealth that trade with distant lands might bring. And there was, too, the simple hunger to know what lay beyond the edge of the map. But whatever the mixture of his purposes, the result was one of the turning points in the story of mankind, for the road that his vessels opened down the African coast led on in the generations after him, around the whole of that continent and across every ocean of the globe, until the isolated kingdoms of Europe were joined to the wider world and the whole age of ocean travel had begun. And it began, in a real and traceable sense, with the patient purpose of this one quiet son of Philippa. That such a man should have come from her nursery is no accident. For everything in him bears the stamp of the mother who made him. His austere and disciplined piety, his steady and unwearied will, his union of high religious zeal with patient practical endeavour were the very qualities that Philippa had lived and taught. And the son who sent the ships into the unknown was in his grave and single-minded devotion to a lofty end, his mother's truest heir. She did not live to see what he would do, dying while he was still a young man newly proved in his first campaign. But the seed of it was her planting, and the age of discovery that flowered from his patient labour was, in a real sense, the fruit of her mothering. The English queen, who taught her sons to reach for the heights, had raised, in this quiet third son, the man who reached furthest of all. There was a daughter, too, who lived, and who would one day go north to marry one of the mightiest princes of Europe and become a duchess of legendary state, presiding over one of the most brilliant courts of the age and carrying her mother's blood and her mother's character into the very heart of the continent. And there were younger sons besides, brave and able men, one of whom would meet a fate of such tragic nobility that his own people came to honour him almost as a saint. It was, by any reckoning, an astonishing family, a constellation of talent and virtue and achievement, such as few royal houses have ever produced at a single stroke, and the wonder of it is not diminished, but only deepened, when we understand how carefully and how deliberately it was made. Among the children of Philippa, there was one daughter who lived to grow up, and her story carried her mother's blood into the very heart of Europe, for she would become, in time, one of the most powerful and cultivated women of her age. She was married, some years after her mother's death, to one of the mightiest princes of the north, the ruler of a rich and brilliant realm that was the very centre of courtly splendour and artistic glory in that age. And as his duchess, she presided over one of the most magnificent courts in all of Christendom, a figure of enormous weight and influence, a patron of art and letters, a shrewd hand in the diplomacy of nations. In her, the gravity and the ability and the high principle of her mother were joined to a great position, and she used them, as her mother would have wished, with wisdom and with force. And through her, the character that Philippa had shaped reached out to touch the affairs of the whole continent, and her blood passed into some of the proudest houses of Europe. There was a younger son, too, whose fate was of a different and a darker kind, and whose story is among the most moving that the age has to tell, for he came in the end to a martyr's death, and was honoured ever after, almost as a saint. He was a pious and gentle prince, not robust in health, who went out in later years upon a bold venture against the Muslim power in Africa, a venture that ended not in triumph, but in disaster. And when the enterprise failed, he was left in the hands of the enemy as a surety, a hostage held against the return of a city his countrymen were asked to give up. But his country would not give up the city, even to save him, and so he remained a captive in a far land, held in hard and worsening conditions, year after weary year, while the price of his freedom was refused. And there, at last, worn out by his long imprisonment, he died, far from home, a captive to the end. He met that terrible fate, by every account, with a resignation and a faith that turned his suffering into a kind of glory, accepting his captivity as the will of God and refusing to let his country ransom him at the price of Christian honour. And his people, looking back, came to revere him as a holy prince, a martyr who had given his life rather than see the faith dishonoured. It was a fate of tragic nobility, the dark thread in the bright weave of the illustrious generation, and it showed that the ideals of faith and sacrifice that their mother had planted in her children could bear bitter fruit as well as glorious. For the same devotion that sent one son reaching around the world, sent another to a lonely death in a foreign prison, and both, in their way, were true to what she had taught them. Neither of these fates, the daughter's greatness nor the youngest son's martyrdom, did Philippa live to see, for both lay years beyond her death, in a future she could only have imagined. In her lifetime, the daughter was a promising girl, and the younger son, a devout child, growing up under her eye with all the rest. And she went to her grave not knowing what heights and what depths her children would climb and plumb, what thrones and what prisons awaited them. But the qualities that carried them there, the ability and the principle and the deep, unbending faith, were her gift and her making. And whether it led to a ducal throne in the heart of Europe or a martyr's cell in Africa, the stamp of their mother was upon them to the end. For Philippa did not leave the raising of her children to nurses and tutors and the ordinary drift of a royal upbringing, as so many great mothers of the age were content to do. She took the shaping of them as the chief and most sacred labour of her days, and she poured into it all her intelligence, all her principle, all her formidable and patient will. She saw to their education herself, gathering the best of teachers and the best of books, and requiring of her sons a breadth and a depth of learning that few princes of the day possessed. She saw to their bodies, that they should be hardy and skilled in arms and horsemanship, fit for the knightly calling, and above all she saw to their souls, planting in them the same deep faith, the same sense of honour and duty and self-command that governed her own life. She meant them to be not merely powerful, but good, not merely princes, but the finest kind of princes, and she laboured at that making with a devotion that never flagged. The manner in which Philippa educated her children was as remarkable as the children themselves, for she brought to their schooling a thoroughness and a seriousness of purpose that few parents of any age have matched, and she oversaw it, in large part, with her own eyes and her own hands. She did not leave the shaping of their minds to hired tutors working out of her sight, as was the common way among the great. She took a close and constant interest in what they learned and how they learned it, chose their teachers with care, and made the schoolroom, in effect, an extension of her own devoted governance. The result was an education of unusual breadth and depth, one that formed not merely accomplished princes, but thoughtful and disciplined and virtuous men. The training she gave them was carefully balanced among the three great parts of a noble upbringing: the mind, the body, and the soul, and she neglected none of them. For the mind, there was a serious grounding in letters and learning, in reading and in the study of good and improving books, so that her sons grew up genuinely lettered, at home in the world of ideas, as few warriors of the age were. For the body, there was a hard training in the physical skills of their rank, in riding and in arms and in all the exercises that fitted a man for the knightly life, so that they should be hardy and capable and brave. And for the soul, above all, there was the deep grounding in faith and in the principles of honour and duty and self-command that she held to be the foundation of everything. For she meant her sons to be virtuous before she meant them to be great, and she built their characters upon the rock of religion. What bound the whole together was discipline, the ordered and purposeful use of time and energy that was the very signature of Philippa's own life, and that she instilled in her children from their earliest years. She taught them, by rule and far more by her own example, to govern themselves, to master their impulses, to turn their hours toward worthy ends and away from idleness and vice. And this habit of self-command, bred into them young, was perhaps the greatest of all the gifts she gave them, the inner discipline that made possible everything they later achieved. The traveller's patient endurance, the navigator's unwearied purpose, the scholar king's grave conscientiousness, all had their root in the disciplined upbringing their mother had given them, in the schoolroom where she had taught them to rule themselves before they should be called to rule others. And through it all ran her own example, which was the most powerful teacher of them all. For children learn far more from what their parents are than from what their parents say. The sons of Philippa grew up, watching a mother who lived every day the principles she pressed on them, who was herself disciplined and devout and studious and dutiful, who practiced in her own person the whole pattern of life she held up for their imitation. They could see in her that the ideals she urged were not empty words, but a way of living that could actually be lived, and that seeing was worth more than any precept. She taught her children, in the end, chiefly by being what she wished them to become, and the golden generation that came out of her schoolroom was, above all, the image and the echo of their remarkable mother. She taught them, by precept and far more by example, that rank was a trust and not a license, that the great were set high in order to serve, that a man's course must be governed and disciplined and turned toward worthy ends. She filled their minds with the noble stories of chivalry and faith, the tales of knights and crusaders and holy kings, until the ideals of that heroic tradition were bred into their very bones. And she matched those ideals with a hard, practical training in the real skills of rule and war and thought. From their English mother, the young princes drew a gravity, a discipline, a devotion, and a reach of ambition that set them apart from the ordinary princes of their time. And when they came to manhood and went out to do the shining deeds for which the world remembers them, they carried her stamp upon everything they did. It is one of the quiet marvels of history, this, that a single woman, an exile from a northern island, working within the walls of her own household, should have shaped a family that would help to reshape the world, and that the ships which would one day feel their way around Africa and across unknown oceans set out, in a sense, from a mother's schoolroom in a Portuguese palace, where a grave English queen taught her sons to reach for the heights. What she built in those children was her true and lasting monument, more enduring than any tomb, and the story of how that greatness came, at last, to its testing point in a bold and perilous venture across the sea, is where our tale must go next. To understand what came next, we must understand the world of ideas in which Philippa's sons had been raised, for it was an age still lit by the old fire of chivalry and crusade. And those ideals were no dead letter to the young princes of Avis, but a living hunger in their blood. They had been brought up on the tales of knights and holy wars, taught to see the winning of honour in arms against the enemies of their faith as the highest calling a prince could follow, and as they came to manhood, they burned, as young men of spirit have always burned, to prove themselves in some real and worthy deed, and not merely in the mock combats of the tournament field. It was not enough, to their minds, to be made knights amid the safe pageantry of a court festival. They wanted to earn their knighthood in true and dangerous war, in a feat of arms that would ring through Christendom and set the seal upon their worth. To understand the bold venture that crowned Philippa's life, and cost her the last of her strength, we must enter for a moment into the world of ideas that governed her sons, the old and glowing world of knighthood and crusade that was, by their day, already passing, but still burned bright in noble hearts. Chivalry was the standard by which the knightly class understood itself and its calling, a lofty rule that bound the fighting man to honour, to courage, to the defence of the church and the protection of the weak, to a life of arms consecrated to worthy ends. It was often honoured more in word than in deed, as all such ideals are, but it was real for all that, a genuine force in the minds of men, and nowhere more so than in a household like Philippa's, where the noblest version of that calling was held up and taught and believed. Bound up with chivalry was the summons of the crusade, the holy war against the enemies of the faith, which had drawn the knighthood of Europe eastward for centuries, and which, though its great days were past, still stirred the blood of pious and ambitious young men. To fight, and if need be, to die against the unbeliever, to win honour and salvation together in a war blessed by the Church, was held to be the noblest calling a warrior could follow. And though the old crusades to the distant east had largely failed and faded, the dream itself lived on, seeking new fields, and found one, for the princes of Portugal, in the Muslim lands that lay just across the water to the south. There, within reach of their own coast, was an enemy of the faith to be fought, a crusade to be waged, merit and salvation to be won. And to the sons of Philippa, raised on the noblest tales of chivalry, the temptation of such a venture was irresistible. What set the sons of Philippa apart was that they took this inheritance with an entire and dangerous seriousness, refusing to let it remain a matter of poetry and pageant. To many a prince of the age, the language of chivalry was a pleasant ornament, worn lightly and meant lightly. But to these young men, formed by a mother who believed every word of it, the call to honour and holy war was a debt that pressed upon the conscience and demanded to be paid. They chafed at the thought of a knighthood conferred amid the flowers and fanfares of a court festival, an empty distinction won at no risk. They wanted the thing itself, the test of mortal danger, the proof of worth in earnest war. And so the ideals bred into them in the schoolroom hardened, as they came to manhood, into a restless hunger for a deed, a bold and perilous undertaking in which they might show themselves the true champions their mother had raised them to be. And in all of this, the hand of their mother is plain. For it was she who had planted these high aims so deep in their hearts, she who had taught them that a prince must be a true and worthy champion, and hold the service of the faith above his own life. The holy venture that her sons conceived was, in a sense, the flowering of her own teaching, the moment when the aims she had bred into them demanded to be made real, and she embraced it with her whole heart. For it was the very thing she had raised them for, that it would carry them to glory and cost her her life, and open the door to an age of discovery she never dreamed of. None could then foresee. But the high aims that drove it were hers, and the sons who pursued it were her making, and the shining enterprise that followed was at its root the fruit of the grave, English queen, and all that she had taught. Out of that hunger, and out of the ambitions and the calculations of their father the king, there grew a bold and secret design, a plan to carry the war across the sea to the Muslim power that lay upon the far shore, and to seize a rich and famous city that guarded the narrow strait between the two continents. The city was a nest of corsairs who preyed upon Christian shipping, and a great mart where the wealth of distant Africa came to be traded, gold and other treasures carried up out of the unknown south. And to take it would be at once a blow struck for the faith in the true crusading spirit of the age, a prize of enormous commercial worth, and a feat of arms glorious enough to satisfy the fiercest young appetite for honour. King and princes together fixed their hearts upon it, and set in motion, with great secrecy, the vast labour of preparing for so daring a stroke. That prize stood at one of the great crossroads of the world, upon the African side of the narrow channel where two seas and two continents almost touch, a gateway through which passed the trade and the traffic of half the known earth. To hold it was to command that gateway, and no Christian power had ever yet dared to plant itself upon that farther shore, so that the mere conceiving of such a stroke was a thing of breathtaking boldness. It was, moreover, no easy prey, but a strong and wealthy place, well walled and stoutly defended, that would yield to nothing less than a mighty and determined effort. The very difficulty of it was part of the attraction, for an easy conquest would have won no glory, and the king and his sons, weighing the prize against the peril, found in that hard and shining objective exactly the enterprise their ambition craved. The preparing of so bold a stroke was a labour of years, carried on with a secrecy that was itself a marvel, for the very success of the venture depended upon surprise. And the destination was kept a close and jealous secret, even as the vast preparations went forward in plain sight. Ships were built and gathered from every quarter, an army was raised and armed, and provisions on an enormous scale were laid in. And to mask the true target, false rumours were spread and false destinations hinted at, so that neither the enemy across the water nor the watching powers of Europe should guess where the blow was to fall. It was a masterpiece of secret planning, this hiding of a great enterprise behind a screen of misdirection, and it kept the intended victim in the dark until the fleet was almost upon him. When the hour came to gather, the capital upon its river became a scene without precedent in the young kingdom's history, as men and ships and stores flowed in toward it from across the land. The soldiers came, and the sailors, the craftsmen and the labourers, the great lords with their retinues, and the humble men who would pull the oars and bear the arms, and with them came the endless materials of war, the timber and the cordage, the biscuit and the salt meat, the weapons and the armour, piling up along the wharves and the shores. The very air of the place changed, charged with the mingled excitement and dread of a people bending itself to a single mighty effort. And over the crowded water and the swarming quays there hung the sense of some vast thing impending, some stroke that would either crown the kingdom with glory or end in ruin upon a distant shore. In all this vast preparation, Philippa was no idle onlooker, for she gave to the venture not only her blessing, but her labour, throwing the weight of her influence and her prayers behind it, and busying herself, in her own quiet way, with its furtherance. It was she, we are told, who saw to the making of the swords her sons should carry, fine blades wrought against the day of their knighting, a mother's gift prepared in advance for the honour she meant them to win. She followed each stage of the gathering with a close attention, urging on the work, heartening the doubtful, lending to the whole design the steadying force of her faith and her resolve. For this was the enterprise she had raised her sons to undertake, and she meant to see it launched with all that she could give. Little did any of them know, in those busy, hopeful weeks, how soon and how cruelly her part in it would be changed. For it was a mighty undertaking, the boldest that the young kingdom had ever attempted, and the preparations for it went forward over many months, in a fever of shipbuilding and gathering and arming. A huge fleet was to be assembled, and an army to fill it, and supplies laid in for a venture whose very destination was kept a close secret, disguised and hidden, so that the blow, when it fell, should fall by surprise. From every quarter of the realm, men and ships and provisions were drawn together toward the capital upon its river, until the broad waters below the city were crowded with vessels, and the wharves piled high with the stores of war. And over it all hung the excitement and the dread of a mighty enterprise, whose outcome no one could foretell. It was the labour of a kingdom straining every sinew for a single mighty throw, and at the heart of it stood the king and his 3 eldest sons, for whom this venture was to be the proving of their manhood and the making of their fame. And Philippa, the mother of those sons, was the very soul of the enterprise, its truest and most fervent supporter, for everything in her rose to meet a venture so perfectly framed to her ideals. Here was her faith and her love of honour, and her hope for her sons, all joined in one. Here was the crusade she had dreamed of, the worthy deed she had raised her boys to seek, that the chance for them to become indeed the noble knights she had made them in spirit. She threw her whole heart and all her influence behind the design, urging it forward, blessing it, longing to see her sons sail out to win the honour she had taught them to prize above their lives. It was, in a sense, the culmination of her life's work, the hour when the children she had shaped so carefully were to go forth and be, at last, all that she had made them to be. And she awaited the sailing of the fleet with a mother's pride and a mother's fear mingled in her heart. But even as the vast fleet gathered and the day of sailing drew near, a shadow fell across the bright enterprise. The same old shadow that had darkened Philippa's life from her earliest childhood, the shadow of the plague. It came upon the crowded capital as it always came, silent and swift and merciless, moving through the packed and sweltering city, where the army and the fleet lay waiting, striking down rich and poor alike, and into the royal household itself, into the very presence of the Queen who had given her very soul to the venture. The sickness made its quiet and deadly way. The mother who had longed above all things to see her sons sail out in glory was herself to be struck down upon the very threshold of that glory in the cruel and arbitrary manner of the age, by the same pestilence that had taken her own mother from her so many years before. The last summer of Philippa's life was a strange and heavy time, in which the highest hope and the deepest dread of her whole existence met together in a single crowded, sweltering, fateful stretch of weeks. All that season, the capital by the great river was the beating heart of the kingdom's vast enterprise, its waters crammed with the gathering fleet, its streets and squares thronged with the soldiers and sailors and workmen of the venture, the entire city strained to bursting with the labour and the excitement of the coming stroke. Into that packed and feverish capital, under the blazing southern sun, the men and the ships and the stores poured in from every quarter of the realm, and over it all hung the mounting anticipation of the bold adventure that was so soon to sail. the venture that Philippa had blessed with all her heart and longed above all things to see set forth. There was, that summer, a strange doubleness in the mood of the capital. A feverish hope and a creeping dread laid one upon the other, as the twin currents of the season ran their course. On the surface, all was anticipation and bustle and pride. The great work driving forward, the talk of the coming glory, the sense of a kingdom upon the edge of a famous deed. But underneath ran a darker undertone, a fear that grew as the hot weeks passed. For word spread of sickness in the streets, of houses shut up and bodies carried out, of the old terror stirring again in the press and the heat. Hope and dread advanced together through that season, the one loud and public, the other whispered and feared, and no one could yet say which of the two would have the mastery when the summer's tale was fully told. And then, as the weeks wore toward their height, the dread that had been abroad in the streets crossed at last the threshold of the palace itself, and the fear that haunted the common people became the private terror of the royal house. What had been, for the family, a distant rumour of sickness in the town became, of a sudden, a matter of their own hearth and their own blood, and the bright, confident mood of the great preparation gave way, within those walls, to anxious watching and dawning grief. The public glory and the private sorrow, so strangely met in that single season, now drew together toward their reckoning, and the fleet that lay so nearly ready to sail must wait a little longer, upon a graver business unfolding within the palace. And yet even here, in this cruel and untimely stroke, there was a kind of terrible fitness, for it drew together the chief threads of her life at its very close. The sickness that had opened her story now closed it. The venture that was the crown of her mothering was there before her, even as she died, and her sons, the golden fruit of all her labour, were gathered about her at the end, ready to sail out and be all that she had made them. The last months of her life were a season of hope and horror mingled, of the fleet and the plague, the glory and the grief. And in the midst of it, dying, she would find the strength for one last and greatest act of mothering, the blessing and the charge and the swords, before she passed from the story she had done so much to shape. But that scene belongs to her deathbed, to which we now come at last. Here it is enough to have seen the strange and heavy summer in which her long life drew toward its close. And so we come, at the last, to the hardest and the most moving passage of her entire story, to a darkened chamber in the summer heat, and a dying queen, and a gathering of grieving sons, and one of the most extraordinary deathbed scenes that the annals of that age have handed down to us. Let us go to her there, gently, in her final hours, and see how a noble woman met her end, and what she found the strength to do, even as death closed in, for it was in her dying, as much as in all her living, that Philippa of Lancaster showed the world what manner of queen and mother she had been. She knew that she was dying, and she met the knowledge as she had met everything in her life, with a clear eye and a steady soul and a will bent still upon her duty. The plague had her fast, and there was no hope, and the physicians could do nothing, and so, in the failing summer days, in a chamber shadowed against the heat, the queen who had given her life to the shaping of her sons gathered those sons about her one last time, to say her farewells and to give them her blessing, and to send them, even from her deathbed, out upon the venture she had loved. It is a scene almost unbearable in its tenderness and its resolve, and the memory of it has come down through the centuries with the force of something too true to be forgotten. She had made ready, before her sickness, 3 swords, one for each of her 3 eldest sons, fine weapons wrought for the crusade that was to make them knights, and now, dying, she called the young men to her bedside and put the swords into their hands. To each she gave his blade, and with it her charge, that he should use it in defense of the faith and of the weak, that he should protect widows and maidens and the helpless, that he should be, in truth and not in name only, the noble knight she had raised him to be. She gave them also relics she had treasured, and her blessing, and her last commands, and above all, she bade them go on with the venture, not to let her death delay or unmake it, but to sail as they had planned, and win the honour she had taught them to seek. Even in her last hours, her thoughts were upon the sailing, upon the wind and the tide and the great enterprise. And it was with the crusade upon her lips and her son's hands in hers that she gave them, at the last, her blessing and her leave to go. About her bed, in that shadowed and sweltering chamber, her sons were gathered, the three eldest whom she had shaped with such care, come to receive her farewell and her blessing. And it was to them, in her failing strength, that she turned the last of her energy and her love. She had no lands to leave them that were hers to give, no treasure to press upon them at the end. What she had to bestow was greater and stranger than gold. The swords she had made ready and the charge that went with them, the distilled inheritance of everything she had taught them. And so, gathering herself, she made of her deathbed a schoolroom one last time, and gave to her sons, in the shadow of her passing, the final and the deepest lesson of their lives. The charge she laid upon her sons, as she put the swords into their hands, was the very distillation of all she had taught them, and it is worth dwelling upon, for it tells us what she most wished them to be. She bade them be true knights, in the fullest and holiest sense of that word, to defend the church and the faith with the blades she gave them, to protect the weak and the helpless, the widow and the orphan and the maiden, to keep their honour bright and their word inviolate, to fear God and to do justice, and to bear themselves all their lives as the noble champions she had raised them to be. It was a mother's last will made over into her son's keeping, not of lands or goods, but of ideals, the charge to carry on, when she was gone, the entire pattern of honour and faith and duty that she had spent her life instilling in them. And she granted them, with the swords, holy relics she had treasured, tokens of the faith in whose service they were to wield those blades. There is a detail in the old accounts of her dying that catches at the heart, for it shows how wholly her thoughts, even at the end, were bound up with the venture she had blessed. As she lay dying, it is said, she asked which way the wind was blowing, and when she was told that it blew fair and steady from the quarter that would carry the fleet across to the African shore, she took it for a sign of God's favour upon the enterprise, and was glad, and urged that they should not delay the sailing on her account, but go and win the honour she had raised them for, even though she would not be there to see them return. To think of a dying woman, in her last hours, turning her thoughts to the wind upon the sea and the sailing of her sons, and taking comfort in a fair breeze she would never feel, is to glimpse the full greatness of her soul, its selflessness, its faith, its unbreakable devotion to the ideals she had made her own. They took the swords from her hands, and the charge with them, and the relics, and her blessing, and something passed, in that moment, from the dying mother to her living sons, the whole weight of the ideals she had spent her life instilling, laid now upon their shoulders as her final bequest. Whatever grief was in that chamber, there was also a kind of solemn glory, the sight of a mother, at the very edge of death, arming her sons for the great work she had raised them to do, and sending them out with her blessing, to be all that she had made them. Her task was done, the charge was given, the swords were in their hands, and there remained for her now only the last surrender, the letting go of the life she had spent so well. And then she died, in the high summer of the year, far from the cold northern island of her birth. In the southern kingdom she had made her own, and a great grief fell upon Portugal, for the people had loved their grave and gentle English queen, and knew what they had lost in her. Her sons and her husband mourned her as few queens have been mourned, and yet, in obedience to her dying wish, they did not turn aside from the venture she had blessed. Within weeks of her death, the great fleet weighed anchor and stood out to sea, carrying the king and the grieving princes toward the far shore and the city they had come to take. And there, in a swift and glorious feat of arms, they stormed and won the place, and the three young men were knighted in the captured city, with the swords their dying mother had given them, exactly as she had willed. And that conquest, won under the shadow of her death, proved to be the door through which Portugal passed into its age of glory. For from that first venture across the sea there grew, in the years that followed, the whole astonishing enterprise of Portuguese discovery, as the son she had borne, the quiet and inward third son, gathered his sailors and his charts, and sent his little ships feeling their way down the endless unknown coast of Africa. Further and further into seas no European had ever crossed, until the way lay open at last around the whole of Africa and on to the Indies and the ends of the earth. The great age of discovery, which would carry European sails across every ocean of the globe, began in a real sense on the day that fleets sailed for the African shore. And behind that fleet, behind those suns, behind the whole vast unfolding of it, stood the grave English mother who had raised the men who made it and blessed the venture from her deathbed, and died before she could see what her sons would do. The fleet sailed within weeks of the Queen's death, a vast armada standing out from the river mouth and turning south toward the African shore, carrying the grieving king and his sons and the flower of the kingdom's chivalry toward the city they had come so far and planned so long to take. The crossing was made, the enemy taken by surprise as the long secrecy had intended, and the assault fell upon the city with a suddenness and a force that carried all before it. And after a sharp and desperate struggle, the great port was stormed and taken, the Christian banners raised upon its walls, the rich prize fallen entire into Portuguese hands in a single day of arms. It was a triumph complete and glorious. The first conquest that the little kingdom had ever made beyond its own shores, and it rang through Christendom as a famous feat, the sudden seizing of a mighty Muslim stronghold by the sons of the north. And there, within the captured walls, amid the spoils of their victory, the young princes were at last made knights, exactly as their mother had wished, girded with the very swords she had given them upon her deathbed. Dubbed in the true and bloody test of war, and not in the safe pageantry of a tournament. It was the fulfillment of all they had longed for, and all she had raised them to be, the winning of their knighthood in a real crusade, in a worthy feat of arms, with their mother's blessing upon them and her blades in their hands. And if there was grief mingled with their triumph, for the one who had made them was not there to see it, there was also the knowledge that they had done exactly as she had bidden, and become, in that hour, the noble champions she had dreamed of. Her dying wish was honoured, her charge fulfilled, her sons made knights with her swords upon the field she had blessed. Yet the true significance of that day reached far beyond the walls of the captured port, for it marked the moment when a small nation at the western edge of Europe turned its face outward toward the open ocean and the unknown earth. Until then, the peoples of Christendom had lived, in a sense, hemmed within their own familiar seas, the wider world a rumour and a mystery, but from this beginning there opened, over the following generations, a reaching out that would join the sundered halves of the earth and set European sails upon waters no one had dreamed of crossing. What began as a single feat of arms became the first step of the longest journey any people had ever undertaken, the patient unlocking of the whole globe. And though the men who stormed the African port could not have known it, they had opened a door that would never again be shut. And behind it all, behind the conquest and the knighting and the voyages and the unfolding age of discovery, stood the figure of the queen who had raised the men who made it, and who had blessed the venture from her deathbed, even as her own life failed. She did not live to see the city taken, nor her sons knighted with her swords, nor the ships go out into the unknown ocean. She died upon the very threshold of it all, in the summer before the triumph. But the enterprise was, in the deepest sense, her doing, for she had made the men who made it, had planted in them the faith and the honour and the reaching ambition that drove it, and had given it, with her dying breath, her blessing and her leave to go. The grave English queen, who had crossed the sea to a foreign throne, had raised in her sons the openers of the world, and that, more than any crown or conquest, was her true and lasting monument. She was laid to rest, in time, in a place worthy of her, in the beautiful abbey her husband had raised in thanks for the victory that had secured his crown, a soaring church of golden stone that stands to this day among the loveliest that the age ever built. There, in the Founder's Chapel, beneath the high and delicate vaulting, king and queen were laid together in a single splendid tomb, and the sculptor who carved their images did a rare and tender thing, for he showed them not stiff and separate, as such figures usually lie, but with their stone hands clasped together, joined together in the affection that had grown between them. And round about them, in that same shining chapel, were gathered in time the tombs of the illustrious sons she had borne and shaped, so that the mother and the golden generation she had made lie together, still in the quiet of that lovely place. 600 years and more after her death. The place where Philippa lies is one of the loveliest that the age ever raised, and it deserves a chapter of its own, for it is a monument not only to her, but to the whole shining history of which she was the mother. It is a great abbey church of pale golden limestone, set in the green country where the famous victory had been won that secured her husband's crown. For the king had vowed, in the hour of that triumph, to raise a house of God in thanksgiving, and he kept his vow with a magnificence that has left one of the supreme masterpieces of the age. Slender and soaring and intricate, its walls worked into a lacework of pinnacles and tracery, the abbey rose over the years into a wonder of delicate grandeur, a prayer in shaped stone offered up for a deliverance, and it became, in time, the resting place of the line that the victory had founded. The chapel that holds them is a marvel in itself, a lofty octagon of pale stone crowned with a great star vault, filled with a soft golden light that falls from high windows upon the tombs below. In the midst of it stands the Founder's monument, the tomb of the king and his English queen, raised up in state beneath the soaring roof, and along the walls around it lie the tombs of their sons, so that the whole chapel is, in effect, the sepulchre of a single illustrious family, parents and children gathered under one roof of pale worked stone. To enter it is to step into a stillness centuries deep, where the founders of an age lie in their carven splendour amid the light and the silence, and where the great deeds and the great sorrows of that family seem to hang, unspoken, in the quiet air. There is no grander nor more peaceful place of rest in all the land. Around them, in that same chapel, were gathered in time the tombs of the sons they had made, the illustrious generation laid to rest near the parents who had shaped them, so that the whole remarkable family lies together, still beneath the soaring vault. The quiet son who sent the ships into the unknown lies there, and the younger son who died a captive and a martyr, his body brought home at last to rest among his kin, and others of that brilliant brood, gathered about the sepulchre of their father and their mother in the chapel of their house. To stand in that place, even now, is to stand in the presence of a whole age of history. The founders of a dynasty and the openers of the world gathered together in the shining silence, at peace after all their labours and their voyages and their griefs. There could be no fitter resting spot for Philippa than this, for it joins in one spot the great threads of her story, the victory that made her husband a king and brought her to Portugal, the marriage that clasped their hands in life and now in stone, and the illustrious children who lie about them and who carried their house to glory. She lies where she belongs, in the heart of the family she made and the realm she served, in a monument as grave and as beautiful as her own character. And the clasped carven hands upon her tomb are a truer memorial to what she was than any inscription could be. The sign of a marriage and a partnership and a shared life that death itself did not end. 6 centuries and more have passed over that golden chapel, and still the king and his English queen lie there together, at the still centre of the age they made. The line that Philippa helped to found, the royal house that sprang from her marriage to the soldier king, went on after her to preside over the most glorious age in the entire history of her adopted country, and it is worth seeing her, at the last, as the mother of that golden line. Her husband had founded the house by his courage and his victory, but it was she who gave it, in her children, its character and its brilliance. And it was the sons and grandsons of their union who carried Portugal to the summit of its greatness. For more than 100 years after Philippa's death, her descendants ruled the kingdom, and under them the little realm upon the ocean's edge became, for a time, the boldest and most far-reaching power in the world, its ships upon every sea, its captains mapping the unknown coasts of the earth. It was an astonishing destiny for so small a kingdom, and it flowed in a direct and traceable line from the enterprise that Philippa's sons had launched and the spirit that their mother had planted in them. The patient reaching out into the unknown that began with the quiet third son grew under his successors into a great national enterprise, carrying Portuguese sails around Africa, across to the Indies, and on toward the ends of the earth, and building for that small nation an empire and a fame out of all proportion to its size. And at the fountainhead of it all stood the house that Philippa had helped to found and had shaped in her children, the dynasty whose age of glory was, in a real sense, the harvest of the seed she had sown in her Portuguese schoolroom. She herself would have been astonished, perhaps, to see what came of her mothering, for she had laboured not for empire or for glory, but for the making of good and worthy men. And the vast unfolding of Portuguese greatness was, to her, an undreamed-of consequence of a humbler and holier work. She had wished only to raise her children to be true knights and faithful Christians, and wise and dutiful princes, and out of that wish, pursued with all her formidable devotion, there grew a dynasty and an age and an enterprise that changed the history of the world. It is the way of such things that the greatest consequences flow from the quietest causes, and that a mother's patient work in a nursery can outlast and outweigh the wars of kings. And so we may see Philippa, at the end, not merely as a queen or a wife or even a mother, but as the still and quiet source of a great river of history, the woman at whose hands a dynasty took its character and a nation took its course. The house of Avis, in its age of glory, was her monument as surely as the chapel where she lies. The age of discovery was her legacy as surely as the blood in her descendants' veins. She had come to Portugal a lonely stranger, and she left it the mother of its greatness, and the little kingdom that had welcomed the foreign bride owed to her, in the end, a debt beyond all reckoning. For she had given it not only a line of kings, but the character and the courage that carried it to the summit of the world. The legacy that Philippa left behind her was out of all proportion to the quiet and inward manner of her life. For, through the children she made, and the ideals she planted, she reached forward to shape ages and events she never lived to see. Most immediately, she left Portugal, the illustrious generation itself, the row of gifted sons, and the remarkable daughter who carried her stamp into the affairs of a continent, and who made the middle years of that century a kind of heroic age for their country. Through them, and through the enterprise they launched, she stands at the very source of the great age of Portuguese greatness, the age of discovery and empire that made her adopted country, for a time, a leader among the nations and a pioneer of the whole modern world. Her blood, too, ran on into the future through her children, mingling with the proudest lines of Europe and carrying something of her character into houses she never knew. Her daughter's marriage into one of the mightiest realms of the north made Philippa the ancestress of princes who would shape the politics of the continent. Her sons founded lines and left descendants who ruled and fought and reigned for generations. And the strain of gravity and ability that she had bred into her family ran on in her posterity, a living inheritance more lasting than any monument of marble. Long after her death, in courts and councils far from the golden chapel where she lay, the blood and the character of the grave English queen were at work in the affairs of nations. And the alliance she had sealed with her marriage endured, as we have seen, beyond anything its makers could have dreamed, binding her native land and her adopted one in a friendship that has lasted from her age to our own. She was the living seal of that bond, the human link between two nations, and the friendship she embodied outlived her by 6 centuries and more, the oldest such alliance in the world. In her own person, she had joined England and Portugal, and the joining held, long after she was dust, a quiet and enduring testimony to the woman who had crossed the sea to make 2 kingdoms one family. Few private persons have ever cast so far a shadow upon the public history of nations as this one devout and dutiful queen. But perhaps her truest legacy was the simplest and the least measurable. The memory of her goodness, which lingered in the land she had served long after the details of her deeds were forgotten. She was honoured, and is honoured still, as one of the best of queens, a model of virtue and devotion and wise and gentle rule, a foreign princess who had made herself the beloved mother of an adopted people. In an age that remembered so many of its great ones for their crimes and their cruelties, Philippa was recalled for her holiness and her kindness and her care. And that memory, handed down across the centuries, is the finest of all her monuments. The kings and the conquests pass and are forgotten, but the memory of a genuinely good woman endures and blesses those who keep it. Ages after the golden chapels have fallen silent, there are 2 images of her we might carry away with us into the quiet of this hour. The first is the dying queen in her shadowed chamber, gathering the last of her strength to press the swords into her sons' hands and to send them out to greatness, even as her own life failed, giving with her final breath her blessing to the venture she would not live to see. Hold that image a moment, the mother at the very edge of death, thinking still not of herself, but of her sons and their honour and the great work she had raised them for. And then set beside it the other image, the quieter and the more peaceful one, of the 2 stone figures lying together in the golden chapel, the king and his English queen, their carved hands clasped together across the deep silence of the centuries, at rest, at last, after all their labours, surrounded by the sons who made their name immortal. That is where she lies now, and has lain for 600 years, the daughter of Lancaster who became the mother of a golden age. And to hold those 2 images together, the dying queen with the swords and the sleeping queen with her hand in her husband's, is to understand something true and lasting about the woman whose life we have shared tonight. So let her rest now, Philippa of Lancaster, in her lovely chapel by the sea, with her king beside her and her illustrious children about her. And let the 6 centuries settle over her again, like a soft and kindly dark. The cold English castle where she was born is a ruin now, and the ships she blessed are long since gone to dust. And the vast enterprise she set in motion has run its course and passed into history. And yet for this one night she has lived again, and we have walked with her from her motherless childhood to her queenly death. And now we may let her go gently back into the peace out of which we called her. There is nothing left to fear for her now, and nothing left to grieve, only the quiet and the rest she so richly earned, and the long ease of a well-lived life brought at last to its close. And as her story grows dim and still around us, let your own thoughts grow dim and still as well. The night is deep now, and you have travelled a great distance into it, and there is nothing more for you to hold on to. Let the golden chapel fade, and the white ships, and the cold northern castle. Let the warmth of your own bed gather you in, and your breath grow slow and even, and your mind begin to drift away into the dark, down toward the place where the story and the sleeper become one, and sleep closes gently over all. Before you slip away entirely, let me thank you, quietly, for spending these few hours of the dark in such far-off and gentle company. If the evening we have passed together is the kind of journey you would care to take again, you are always welcome to subscribe, whenever the wish should come to you. And another of these quiet nights will find its way to you in time. There is no hurry about any of it. It is simply here, waiting, whenever you should wish to return. But that is a matter for the morning, and the morning is a long way off. For now, there is only the night, and the rest you have earned. And the last few words I leave with you as you go: sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.